This hearing of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission will come to order. Today's hearing, I would like to thank, first of all, at the outset, our witnesses for sharing their expertise and views. What I believe is a very, very important and timely hearing following a week in which the U.S. Department of State designated Nigeria a country of particular concern, or CPC country, and also when the chief prosecutor for the International Criminal Court, Fatou Bensouda, announced that a well-founded basis exists for investigating Nigeria for crimes against humanity and war crimes, including investigating both terror organizations such as Boko Haram and the Nigerian security forces. I would note that the focus that the Lantos Commission has had over the years, with numerous hearings and briefings on Nigeria, and that I have had as past chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, Global Human Rights. I now serve as its ranking member and co-chairman of this commission. We have focused on Nigeria for a very, very long time, and many of us have traveled there, met with survivors of the Chibok girls' abduction, some family members, as well as some of the young women, and have pressed the case of human rights, especially as it relates to terror organizations, for many years. And there's been both sides of the aisle have been very focused on this, as it ought to be, and the executive branch. The United States and the international community, I believe, must do more to mitigate the violence because, above all, the dire situation on the ground warrants it. The killings, the kidnappings, and sexual abuse is absolutely unconscionable. We should do more because the people of Nigeria deserve to live in peace and freedom with their fundamental human rights guaranteed and protected, and because Nigeria is the largest country in Africa, and what happens there has an outsized impact on West Africa and in Africa as a whole. Nigeria is so large, its population is forecast by some to reach over 400 million by 2050, overtaking the United States as the world's third most populous country. And its economic and political leadership in sub-Saharan Africa is so impactful that we simply cannot ignore it. A stable and prosperous Nigeria contributes to stable and prosperous neighbors. Conversely, an unstable Nigeria, racked by poverty and violence, does not contribute to the well-being of its neighbors, but rather can lead to their destabilization in turn. I chaired a hearing on Nigeria almost 2 years ago to this day, noting that Nigeria was at a crossroads at that time. Today we see escalating violence along ethnic and religious lines exacerbated by economic, social, and political tensions. It is getting worse. Among the 7 Nigerian hearings that I previously chaired were a series of hearings that with respect to the designation of Boko Haram as a foreign terrorist organization, or FTO, along with the bipartisan bill which I introduced, H.R. 3209, that would have called for that designation. While it may sound surprising to some today, for the historical record, it must be stated that the designation of Boko Haram as a foreign terrorist organization was strenuously opposed by the State Department at that time, then led by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and Assistant Secretary for Africa Johnny Carson. At one of my hearings in 2012, July 10th to be exact, I asked the Secretary why the Obama administration refused to designate Boko Haram as an FTO, foreign terrorist organization, and he said, quote, "It's an important question. We have indeed designated 3 individuals who we think are in top leadership positions to that list, but we have not designated the entire organization because we do not believe that Boko Haram is a homogeneous organization. We believe that the larger element of Boko Haram is not interested in doing anything but attempting to disgrace the Nigerian government." The refusal to designate Boko Haram an FTO went on for about 3 years. This, however, changed when John Kerry became Secretary of State and Linda Thomas Greenfield became the Assistant Secretary for Africa. In fact, it was at a November 2013 hearing that I chaired that Linda Thomas Greenfield publicly announced that Boko Haram would be designated a foreign terrorist organization. It was right before we were going to mark up the bill. So today, thankfully, there is a widespread recognition that Boko Haram, along with its breakaway and perhaps now more powerful faction, the Islamic State West Africa, is clearly a terror threat. But today's hearing will address a related but not as clearly understood phenomenon, which is the violence, mass killings, and atrocities in the Middle Belt of Nigeria that is a correlate to the violence perpetrated by Boko Haram and others. These acts of horrific violence, which we will hear testimony about, are committed in large part by Fulani militants. And I want to underscore that it's important that we do name those responsible for the violence, that its ethno-religious component, because there has been a lot of moral equivocation on this point, including by the State Department. Yet the situation has some degree of complexity. Yes, there are tensions between farmers and pastoralists exacerbated by climate change. There are counter reprisals committed against members of the Fulani community, although they are relatively rare, including those who are innocent of any wrongdoing. But that does not negate the fact that the largest dominant driver of conflict in the Middle Belt region is committed by Fulani extremists who appear driven in large part by ethno-religious chauvinism against mostly Christian farmers, though I do note that there are elsewhere Shia Muslims who are also victims, and that intra-Sunni conflicts also exist within the Muslim community as well. Nigerian Bishop William Avenya will testify today that, and I quote in part, "The mass slaughter of Christians in Nigeria's Middle Belt, by every standard, meets the criteria for a calculated genocide from the definition of the Genocide Convention." And yet he notes, and I quote him again, "No one has ever been arrested or questioned or prosecuted or convicted of any charge related to this spree of killings which has been going on for at least 5 years." In its November 18, 2020 report to the International Criminal Court, the Jubilee Campaign writes, and I quote in pertinent part, "Violence that has taken place in Nigeria's Middle Belt is spiraling out of control, costing the lives of thousands of civilians and destabilizing the country and region. The violence is often characterized as a, quote, intercommunal conflict between herders and farmers over natural resources. However, the well-worn label is now obsolete due to the increasing asymmetry in attacks, as well as the steadily increasing frequency and organizational planning of Fulani militant attacks against civilian targets." It's worth noting that what separates this situation from that of Boko Haram and the Islamic State, West Africa, is the fact that the Nigerian government under President Buhari is dominated by the Fulani. This is true of the military and the state security forces, but increasingly other institutions of power as well, including the Supreme Court of Nigeria, where Buhari engineered the ouster of Chief Justice Walter Onengan. We have also seen the sidelining of members of the Fulani community who have demonstrated a commitment to peace, including the ouster of the Emir of Kano in March of this year, at a time when the COVID epidemic was becoming the focus of our attention and all eyes were off that situation. While there is now a consensus that Boko Haram is engaged in terrorism, that consensus breaks down when the issue of Fulani extremism comes up, a topic I hope we will explore today and gain a better understanding of. I'm also concerned about the apparent inability, or perhaps even reluctance, of the Nigerian federal government under President Buhari to stop the violence in the Middle Belt, or even at times to unequivocally condemn the attacks. As I have said before, it's critically important that Fulani political leaders such as President Buhari, Fulani leaders, religious leaders such as the Sultan of Sokoto, and Fulani institutions such as the Cattlemen's Association, all of whom have authority and influence among the Fulani militants, unequivocally condemn these attacks and use their power and influence to promote peace and to promote reconciliation. It is not sufficient that such condemnation be issued in English as well. Rather, they must be articulated in Hausa and Fulfulde. Again, I want to thank my colleagues who will be joining us today, and I would like to yield. We do have some members who are here and some who are here virtually who might want to make opening comments. So, Mr. McGovern, Co-Chair McGovern, are you?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. And I join my colleague and Co-Chair Chris Smith in welcoming the witnesses and the public to this Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission hearing on the deteriorating human rights situation in Nigeria with a focus on the Middle Belt. I understand that there are other members of the commission who will be joining us or who may submit written statements for the record. I appreciate their participation, and I look forward to what they will have to say. Ambassador Brownback, it's good to see you again, and I'll take this opportunity to thank you for your work as Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom. I know that you have spoken out on behalf of members of many faiths, including Uyghur and other Turkic Muslims and Tibetan Buddhists in China and Rohingya Muslims in Burma. As a practicing Catholic, I benefit greatly from the freedom of religion that we have historically enjoyed here in the United States. I am also deeply aware that unless and until freedom of belief is guaranteed for everyone on an equal basis, whatever their faith tradition, it is not truly guaranteed for anyone. So I appreciate your work. Nigeria is important. It is Africa's most populous country and its largest economy, an influential regional political actor and a top trading partner, recipient of foreign investment and beneficiary of U.S. foreign assistance. Nigerians make up the largest African-born population in the United States. Nigeria is also facing very serious and long-standing human rights challenges with characteristics and dynamics that vary by region. In the Northeast, conflict between the military and U.S. designated foreign terrorist organizations, Boko Haram and the Islamic State West Africa province, has killed tens of thousands over the past decade, displaced millions, and caused a protracted humanitarian crisis. Most members of Congress are familiar with Boko Haram's abduction of 276 girls from Chibok in 2014, and ISWAP's abduction of 110 girls from Dapchi in 2018. Although Muslim communities in northeast Nigeria have borne the brunt of the violence of these two groups, the victims of the Chibok and Dapchi were Christians. In Nigeria's northwest, conflict between pastoralists and farmers has escalated as part of a broader deterioration in security conditions involving cattle rustling, kidnapping, ethnic massacres, and emergent Islamic extremist activities. Just last week, more than 500 schoolboys, apparently mostly Muslim, were abducted from a boarding school in Katsina State in the northwest. A day later, Boko Haram, whose name means Western education is forbidden, issued a video claiming responsibility for the abduction. According to news reports, 333 boys are still missing. Farmer-herder violence also has surged in the central Middle Belt, an ethnically and religiously diverse region where disputes over access to resources coincide with cleavages between Christian and Muslim communities. This region is the focus of the hearing today. I want to be clear that the violence unfolding throughout Nigeria is a tragedy. No violent death is acceptable. No one should have to live in fear of being attacked by armed groups or by a country's police or security forces for that matter. It is deeply unfortunate that the Nigerian state is failing to provide protection for its civilian population or to ensure accountability for the victims of violence. We know from experience that these failures can feed an escalation of violence. So the question for us is, what can we do about it? This commission approaches human rights violations from two angles: how to respond when they occur and how to prevent them in the first place, especially when it comes to situations with a risk of atrocities like mass killings. Prevention must be a priority. The Simon Scott Center at the U.S. Memorial Holocaust Museum recently issued its annual statistical risk assessment for mass killings. The center calculates that Nigeria faces a 7.3% risk of a new mass killing of at least 1,000 people over the next year. That's a 1 in 14 chance, an increase from the past 10 years. So prevention has to be the name of the game here. Now, we've looked at the situation in the Middle Belt before. The last hearing was in 2018. We've talked with many experts on Nigeria and on human rights and reviewed a lot of solid research. We've found widespread consensus that the underlying drivers of conflict in the Middle Belt are complex and multidimensional: competition for political and economic power, disputes over access to land and resources exacerbated by the impacts of climate change, and impunity for past violence that gives rise to reprisal killings. So I hope that our witnesses today will provide recommendations as to what more the U.S. government can and should be doing to address these underlying drivers. For my part, let me say that I look forward to working with with Co-Chair Smith next Congress, assuming that we are both reappointed, on a hearing that examines the links between climate change, environmental degradation, and the prevention of atrocities. One last thought. We know that the language used to describe conflicts is important. As we describe the reality in Nigeria and other conflict-ridden societies, we must not allow ourselves to contribute to polarization by reducing whole populations to the other. I close by asking unanimous consent to include in the record of this hearing the following materials: a statement for the record from Amnesty International USA, a statement for the record from Fatima Madaki, Project Manager for Advancing Religious Tolerance, Search for Common Ground, a statement for the record from Father Bator, Section 6 recommendations from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, report titled by any other name, 2020 USURF Nigeria Country Update, and additional materials as appropriate. Again, I thank the chair for yielding and for doing this hearing, and I would yield back my time.
I want to thank my good friend and colleague, the co-chair, for his comments, and without objection, all of the inclusions for the record will be made a part of the record. I'd like to now yield to Commissioner Jackson Lee, gentlelady from Texas.
Let me thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the co-chairman, Chairman McGovern, for the opportunity of this vital and important hearing. Let me say to my good friend from New Jersey, we have traveled together, we have looked at these issues, we've looked at issues in Africa and really around the world, joined with Ms. McGovern's passion for human rights, and all of us have had the opportunity and privilege to have served with the late Tom Lantos, and we know what his passion is. The Middle Belt conflict is driven by violence that is based upon ethnically and religiously diverse region that adjoins the Nigeria's largely Muslim north and its predominantly Christian south. Mixed in with that is competition for land, for political and economic power, and as I said, disputes over land. So let me begin by saying to the President of Nigeria, to the Nigerian government, to its houses of upper house and lower house, to the governors, this is my message. A land that has such bounty, a land that is rich in resources, that is now almost the largest or the largest nation on the continent of Africa. It is high time for the Nigerian government to take this conflict, these conflicts seriously. I don't know how much longer the world can look to Nigeria for its future, for the young and bright residents and citizens that it has looking for opportunity, and all they see is internal bloodshed, seemingly with a government that has turned its back and its head. Now is the time. Just a few months ago, I stood with Nigerian Americans in my district who, Mr. Chairman, were fighting against human rights abuses by law enforcement officers, not in the context of America, but in the context of just standing on the sidewalk and being abused, or living in your house and being abused. So human rights violations are far and wide. And it is important that we recognize the importance of this hearing, where we discuss the ongoing conflict in Nigeria's Middle Belt, which has been subjected both to ethnic and sectarian conflict that has killed and displaced thousands of innocent persons. I too acknowledge Ambassador Brownback, Ambassador Tan, and many of the other witnesses. And as I give a brief statement, I do want to acknowledge the kidnapping of 300 school-age boys that occurred on Friday, December 11th. How appalling. Because I was in Nigeria, the first members of Congress to go after the taking of the Chibok girls. I went to the north. I saw the parents, the depth of despair. And those girls, many of them have never returned, never returned. According to the Associated Press, Boko Haram is responsible for the heinous act of aggression, and I'm deeply appalled again by the Nigerian government. We have offered our help, both in terms of, as our Chairman has said, Mr. McGovern, in terms of outreach and education and diplomacy, and also in support, peaceful support of the Africa Command. We must come together to not only find these children immediately and return them to their families safe and sound, but also confront these terrorists so the atrocity will never happen again. According to the newly released annual statistical risk assessment and the Holocaust Museum's analysis against genocide, Nigeria as a whole faces a 7.3% risk of experiencing a new mass killing by the end of 2021. I don't think we can take that. A new mass killing, making it the 6th highest in the world. For context, in last year's SRA, Nigeria was ranked 17th with a 5% risk. As co-chair of the Congressional Nigerian Caucus, as well as a member of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, I'm glad to be in this hearing, but I'm saddened to be in this hearing. Now we go to the Nigerian Middle Belt is at hand between sedentary farmers and mobile livestock herders. However, we would be remiss if we did not acknowledge the tendency of these clashes to assume ethno-religious dimensions, given the most of the herders are ethnically Fulani and Muslim, and whereas the majority of the farmers are Christians of various ethnicities. As violence has escalated in recent years, many analysts and advocates have expressed concern over political rhetoric and media portrayals that attribute unified, often nefarious aims to the Fulani and an internally diverse and expansive ethnic group that spans much of Central and West Africa. We can't blame one group over another. This commission, the late Tom Lantos, was in the business of solving problems, acknowledging human rights, and getting a resolution. With this in mind, the U.S. Department of State recently designated Nigeria as a country of particular concern for violations of religious freedom, opening the country up to possible economic sanctions. What were once spontaneous attacks have been premeditated, scorched earth campaigns in which marauders often take villages by surprise at night. Between 2011 and 2016, nearly 2,000 Nigerians were killed annually due to these farmer-herder conflicts. Furthermore, tens of thousands of people have been displaced, with properties, crops, and livestock worth billions of naira being destroyed, devastating local and state economies. There is no doubt that this conflict has a very real, immediate impact on society. And just because it's on the continent of Africa, I am so glad that we at the Tom Lantos Commission are not ignoring it, are not saying it's just on Africa's land, because if it continues, it will devastate the country of Nigeria that has the resources that can help the world and the largest population or growing population in Africa. Moreover, violence in the Middle Belt surged in 2018, expanding into the areas that were previously secure, driving thousands more from their homes. Finally, let me just say, as I submit and ask the unanimous consent to submit my entire statement into the record, all of this is exacerbating the agricultural needs of the continent and also around the world. It is time for this issue to be resolved. It is time for the ethnic and sectarian religious conflict to stop being the basis of bloodshed. And yes, Mr. Chairman, co-chairman, it is time for the Nigerian government, the president of Nigeria, having just recently gotten through an election, its parliament, its Congress, to stand up and dig into resolutions of this humanitarian crisis. And with that, I wish for the governors of those states as well to be added in that, to find a peaceful solution that people might live in peace. And I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ms. Jackson-Lee. Commissioner, without objection, your full statement, as you've asked, will be made a part of the record. I'd like to now yield to my good friend and colleague, also from Texas, Mr. Green.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm honored that you would allow me to be a part of this august body for today's hearing. I'm also honored to say that you and I forged a friendship when we had an opportunity to travel abroad together, a friendship that continues and will continue. I have great respect for you and what you have been doing in the area of human rights abroad. I'd also like to thank the co-chair, McGovern. He has demonstrated time and time again that when injustice is threatening the lives of people, the betterment of people, that he will take a stand, and he will do it boldly. He will do it on the floor of the House of Representatives. He will do it publicly. He will do it before the press. He has demonstrated that he will take a bold stand. I must also thank my dear friend and colleague, Congressman Joaquin Castro from Texas. He has been a great partner in this effort to bring justice to the people of Nigeria. He has made some very powerful statements. I'd like to read just one statement from a press release that he and I have issued today. His statement reads, Congress should immediately pass this resolution, and he's speaking of the resolution that I will say more about in just a moment, H-Res 1216. Congress should immediately pass this resolution and send a powerful message to the people of Nigeria that we stand in solidarity, both here and in the United States and around the world. We must work toward ending police brutality. I ask that the statement be made a part of the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. I also would like to thank the Nigerian community in Houston, Texas, Professor Christian Ulesi, who has been a great partner in helping us assemble the community. I thank the Eco Club Houston, the Imo Daughters Exclusive Houston, the Nidi Ichi Cultural Association Houston, the Nigerian American Multicultural Council Houston, the Nigeria Americans United Political Action Committee. And there are many others that I should be thanking, and I regret that time won't permit me to cover them all. I'm here today, Mr. Chairman, because Black lives matter wherever they may be. I'm here because, paraphrasing one of the witnesses who will give testimony today, who is an attorney, Attorney Udo Judy Ilo, paraphrasing him, the Nigerian country has lost its soul. And I'm here because there is something that we can do. We have a resolution that is pending in the Foreign Affairs Committee. I'm here because we can pass this resolution and say to the world that we will not tolerate the injustices occurring in Nigeria, that we won't be muted, that we will speak up, and that we will stand up. I'm here because while this resolution may not be enough, I'm always reminded of my grandmother's admonition to me. She referred to me as Alexander, and she would remind me that when all you can do is not enough, you must do all that you can. The resolution isn't enough, but it is something that we can do. And I'd like to, at this time, if I may, insert a copy of the resolution for the record as well. I'd also like to submit for the record a copy of an article-styled analysis of CCTV footage from Leaky Toll Gate raises new questions about shooting. And this is an analysis that CNN participated in. I'd like to read one sentence. It reads, the footage, referring to footage from the shooting, corroborates the timings CNN reported for the gunshots fired by the Army. It also shows soldiers approaching protesters and firing shots. There's much more to be said. I ask that it be placed in the record. And finally, what I'd like to do now is simply read some of what the resolution contains, begging that my colleagues who have not signed on to it would do so, and indicating that my request will be made to have this resolution brought to the floor, because not only is time of the essence, lives are at risk. The resolution reads in part, and I would indicate that Mr. Castro is a co-sponsor, as is Ms. Lee of California, as is the many other members, without going through the entire list. But there are members who are sincere and want to be a part of this, and I ask that other members would join us also. It reads in part, whereas on October 20th, 2020, armed security forces reportedly indiscriminately fired live ammunition on a crowd of peaceful protesters that had gathered at the Lekki toll gate in Lagos, Nigeria, resulting in numerous deaths and injuries in an event now known as Black Tuesday. It reads further, whereas there has been significant evidence of police violence and abuse by SARS in Nigeria, we must not tolerate, and we must thoroughly, immediately investigate in order to achieve justice for these victims. Whereas all peaceful protesters who were wrongfully arrested for participating or supporting the End SARS protest must immediately be released. Whereas there must be an immediate independent investigation of the action that led to the killing of and the use of deadly force against protesters at the Lekki toll gate on October 20th, 2020. And I will now go to the be it therefore resolved and bring this to closure. Be it therefore resolved that the House of Representatives condemns the violent crackdown on peaceful protesters by the Nigerian security forces and calls on the government to desist from the persecution, harassment, and infringement of the human rights of any and all Nigerians for exercising their rights to protest. And finally, calls on the African and international human rights community to conduct independent investigations into the use of deadly force against protesters at the Lekki toll gate on October 20th, 2020. Mr. Chairman, I ask that the items I call to the attention of the Commission be submitted for the record if there are no objections.
That objection?
And I just simply close with this. The world looks to us for leadership, notwithstanding any circumstances to the contrary. This is our moment to take a stand, to be a part of this mission of mercy to help the people in Nigeria. And one of the things that we can do is to pass this resolution and hopefully send the message to the world that we will take a bold stand for the people of Nigeria and that Black lives matter wherever they may be. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. And without objection, Mr. Green, your materials will be made a part of the record. So.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Let me, and thank you for, we have traveled together. We've worked on humanitarian issues, including when the Philippines got ravaged by a terrible, terrible storm. And it was great to be with you there and elsewhere. So, and thank you for being here today. Today we do have three very, very distinguished and accomplished leaders as our witnesses from the U.S. Department of State, an Assistant Secretary and two ambassadors at large, as well as a very distinguished private panel that includes a Nigerian bishop who will be connecting with us virtually, and a baroness from the UK who will also be doing likewise. So leading off our first panel is Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, Sam Brownback. Ambassador Brownback is a former governor, senator, and representative from Kansas. While a member of the Senate and House, he worked actively on a whole range of religious freedom issues, including being a key sponsor of the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998 that was authored by Congressman Frank Wolf. He was, when Darfur was just a horrible area of misery and killing, Sam Brownback made the trip there and brought a great deal of attention to what the Bashir government was doing in the Sudan. We have worked together, he and I, on many issues, including human trafficking. He is a very strong proponent of protecting innocent human life, including unborn children. He is no stranger to the Lantos Commission, and in fact, he testified before the commission last summer at our hearing on the worldwide persecution of Christians. I want to thank him especially for his leadership in the last few days in the designation of Nigeria as a country of particular concern, one of the most egregious violators in the world, where a whole set of sanctions potentially could be levied against the government for its egregious behavior vis-a-vis religious freedom. Our next witness will be Ambassador at Large for Global Criminal Justice, Morris Tan, who was the youngest full professor of law at Northern Illinois University College of Law, where his areas of expertise include international criminal law, international human rights law, and constitutional law. Ambassador Tan was a founding professor of the first American Juris Doctor program in Asia at Hangdong International Law School in South Korea. He has an excellent team that has been working with him. We've been very privileged to work with him and his team over these many, many months. Then we'll hear from Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, Bob Destro, who is a human rights advocate and civil rights attorney with expertise in elections, employment, and constitutional law. Assistant Secretary Destro has served on the faculty of Catholic University's Columbus School of Law since 1982 and served as its interim dean from 1999 to 2001. He was founding director of the Interdisciplinary Program in Law and Religion and served as the director of the Institute for Policy Research and Catholic Studies from June 2017 to September of 2019. More than that, Bob is a good longtime friend, so I do welcome him both professionally and privately, and to all of our witnesses for being here. But I'd like to now yield the floor to Ambassador Sam Brownback. Mr. Ambassador.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman Smith, and I want to thank you for hosting this hearing, doing this, and I also just want to recognize at the outset your leadership and Congressman McGovern and Congresswoman Jackson Lee and Green in these topics as well. Chris and I share a distinction of being two people whose visas have been banned in China because of our human rights advocacy. And I deem that something of a worthiness that it's been recognized. And also I want to thank the co-chairman McGovern for all of his work on many human rights issues, and indeed the whole panel. We've been fellow travelers on these topics for many years, and it's a pleasure to be in front of you and keep pushing on these topics. They are just critically important that the United States takes the leadership on these topics. This is an important hearing. We have growing concerns at State Department about the ways in which violence in Nigeria intersects with religion. 2020 has seen rising violence in many parts of West Africa, including Nigeria. Religiously motivated human rights abuses and discrimination, while fortunately not as common as in some other areas of the world, have been rising in recent years. Violence has unfolded across rural Nigeria. Unfortunately, violence often plays out along faith lines, even if conflicts were not originally religious, both because of the composition of farmer and herder groups and because of the history of ethno-religious tension exacerbated by a lack of accountability. While the Nigerian government has deployed security forces to troubled areas, they have been unable to stop the violence, and improvements are needed in security responses to ensure the protection and promotion of human rights. Violence prevention also requires a whole-of-community approach, of which security responses are a key part. During his annual review of the state of religious freedom in all countries, as required by our law, Secretary Pompeo determined that Nigeria has, quote, engaged in or tolerated particularly severe violations of religious freedom, and therefore moved Nigeria from the special watch list, where it had been placed last year, to the country of particular concern list. We strongly condemn violence in Nigeria aimed at communities because of their faith, whether those communities are Christian or Muslim, including through attacks targeting religious gatherings, To end these cycles of violence, the Nigerian government must hold to account individuals who perpetrate such unlawful violence and human rights abuses. Failure to do so contributes to an environment of escalation and dangerous volatility. Conflicts between herdsmen and farmers in the north central region continued throughout the year, although violence has fallen somewhat since a peak in 2018. While these groups are predominantly Muslim and Christian, there are both herd and farmers that are from both faiths. In the past year, religious groups and NGOs have expressed concern that this conflict has taken on increasingly religious undertones. Hundreds of civilians of both faiths died as a result of the violence, and there were several cases of intercommunal violence during which places of worship were burned and religious ceremonies attacked. Both federal and state authorities in the country of Nigeria, unfortunately, are weak. On the other hand, we have heard repeatedly from religious community representatives who see religious freedom in Nigeria deteriorating, including what they assess as an increasing threat of mass atrocities. Local and international NGOs and religious organizations criticize the government's seeming inability to prevent or mitigate violence between Christian and Muslim communities. For example, in late November, we observed attacks between Christians and Muslims in Kaduna State that displaced a Fulani village, destroyed farm equipment and food stocks, and further strained livelihoods in these communities. The Kaduna State governor authorized state relief services to aid afflicted villages and directed state authorities to hold conflict and reconciliation talks with aggrieved communities. However, retaliatory attacks occurred between the communities, demonstrating yet again that the government is unable or unwilling to prevent conflict from reoccurring. There have been attacks specifically targeted towards houses of worship in the middle belt of Nigeria, including March attacks in southern Kaduna where 4 churches were burned, an April attack in Niger that killed 12 people and abducted a couple. Forceful conversions of Christian women is happening in some intercommunal abductions, and the federal government has no policy to deal with the issue. The government readily admits that it has struggled to address the increase in kidnapping cases over the past 5 years. We also have heard that while studies and commissions of inquiry are conducted in Nigeria, the government does not follow through to address the issues. Now, this is an important point. Governments can not only react to violent incidences, they must enact and implement policies that prevent future conflict, create the foundations for peaceful and lasting resolutions, and promote respect for human rights and justice for all. And when they do react to violence, they must order through thorough and legitimate investigations of attacks and follow through on prosecution of the perpetrators. Otherwise, impunity will continue for attackers and victims will be left without justice, and the society loses faith. Lack of information about perpetrators of attacks also leads to unhelpful stereotypes. Violence has been attributed to Fulani groups, though most Fulani are peaceful, and even among those who are not peaceful, there is a wide range of groups and interests in this broad and diverse population. Yet this region has had a long tradition of hospitality, tolerance, and pluralism, which is a cultural asset. Throughout Nigeria, religion and religious identity form the core of personal identity. Religious leaders, as part of a robust civil society, can ease the tensions that drive communal violence and violent extremism, and they can also be a positive voice for good governance. Faith institutions and religious leaders working with government and other civil society groups all have very important roles to play in increasing dialogue and understanding and reducing violence. Faith communities themselves also play a critical role. Along with civil society, the Nigerian government at the federal, state, and local levels must be a part of the solution. We're mindful of its capacity to affect change and to strengthen protections of religious freedom and ensure security for all, regardless of faith. It is a challenge affecting the next generation. Leadership from the Nigerian government and from the international community to support moderated dialogue among local communities on issues of social discrimination, religious freedom, access to justice, and natural resource management can help build broad national consensus on how best to confront the challenges to peace in pluralistic societies. I look forward to your questions and our continued collaborations towards these goals. This is an important hearing at an important time, and we need to bring forward solutions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for your very eloquent statement and for your leadership. It is longstanding and it's making a difference. And obviously, we'll wait for questions, but I do look forward to the testimony now of Ambassador Tan. Mr. Ambassador, are you there?
Yes. Chairman McGovern, Chairman Smith, distinguished members of the Commission, distinguished fellow panelists. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today and for the long-standing efforts of this Commission to promote, defend, and advocate for international human rights. I quoted the late Representative Lantos in my scholarship and do honor and respect the work of this commission that is named in his honor. And I welcome the opportunity to speak with you today about the dire situation in Nigeria's north central region. The Office of Global Criminal Justice is actually unique among foreign ministries of the world. It focuses on mass atrocity crimes, namely war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And we are involved in formulating U.S. policy on justice and accountability for mass atrocities. Our mandate also includes atrocity prevention and mitigation. Generally speaking, from my perch in the Office of Global Criminal Justice, the most important priority is that we take action to prevent atrocities, to ameliorate the effects of atrocities when they do occur, to bring justice to the victims of atrocities, and to hold accountable those who are responsible for atrocities. Making the decision whether to characterize a situation as a specific type of mass atrocity, e.g. genocide, crime against humanity, war crimes, is a serious one. Many governments will not make such statements officially, preferring to leave the question to judicial bodies. The United States similarly leaves it to courts in most cases. However, in a limited number of occasions, the Secretary of State has determined whether the U.S. government should characterize particular abuses as genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, or ethnic cleansing. Since the United States ratified the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, or the Genocide Convention as it's known, in 1988, at least two common elements exist in how the Secretary makes an atrocity determination. First, an analysis of all the facts available to the United States occurs. Sometimes the United States expends resources to seek out additional facts prior to making a determination. Second, an application of the facts to the law occurs to determine if the terms are legally available. So, for example, if we were to review whether genocide has taken place, we would look at the federal genocide statute and also the Genocide Convention, including any U.S. understandings about the convention. While no automatic trigger for atrocity determinations exist, the absence of a U.S. atrocity determination does not necessarily mean that a specific atrocity is not taking place, or that the U.S. government believes that the atrocity is not taking place. With regard to Nigeria, the country continues to be at great risk for mass killings. For example, with the 300 kidnapped boys just a couple of days ago, and the majority of the Chibok girls disappeared in 2014 still missing, there's much to be concerned about. And the risk is not only from private individuals and groups, but also from the governmental security sector. Just last month, while Assistant Secretary Destro was in Nigeria, government forces opened fire on protesters at the Lekki toll gate in Lagos, reportedly resulting in 51 casualties, including 12 dead. The herder-farmer conflicts in the north central region include mass killings. The herdsmen initiating the conflict are most often Fulani, with victims largely from predominantly Christian ethnic groups. To be sure, the problem is complex. Resource competition, demographic pressure, poor governance, and intercommunal grievances commonly take on an ethno-religious character. The bottom line is that violence in Nigeria's north central region continues to cause displacement and death. Last week, the United States designated Nigeria as a country of particular concern for engaging in or tolerating, quote, systematic, ongoing, egregious violations of religious freedom, end quote. We also designated Boko Haram, ISIS West Africa, and others as entities of particular concern. The White House has also reiterated that, quote, the United States is deeply concerned by religion-based violence in Nigeria, particularly the killing and persecution of Christians, end quote. Indeed, as we approach Christmas here at home, many of us look forward to the holiday with joy and excitement. At the same time, cannot help but to also remember those who live in contexts where major holidays like Christmas signal an opportunity for those who do not value the freedom of religion to intentionally commit horrific and barbaric acts to instill anxiety and fear. Last Christmas Day, the Islamic State West Africa beheaded 11 Christians, and the next day released a gruesome video of the executions. According to Open Doors, in 2019, 1,350 Christians were killed in the band of Nigerian provinces, inclusive of the North Central region, sometimes referred to as the Middle Belt. And that number, 1,350, represents approximately 1/3 of all Christians killed for being Christians in 2019. The government of Nigeria's inability to protect victims from the violence perpetrated by Fulani and others in the North Central region is unacceptable, and its failure to bring such perpetrators to justice must not stand. In fact, Nigeria must hold all perpetrators accountable, including government officials. A lack of justice for victims and impunity for perpetrators creates an atmosphere that perpetuates cycles of violence and abuse. As such, we support appropriate efforts to promote justice and accountability for atrocities and other violations and abuses committed in the context as the subject of today's hearing, which is focused on Nigeria's North Central region. We believe that such efforts are critical to prevent future atrocities, as well as to redress in a meaningful way those that have already taken place. We're committed to helping Nigeria reform its security sector and improving governance. It is in the national interest of the United States to support Nigeria in this endeavor. U.S. efforts to support civilian security cannot, however, be a substitute for Nigerian political will. To ensure our continued cooperation, we emphasize to our Nigerian partners that they must professionalize their security forces, ensure they are under an accountable chain of command, and, where appropriate, hold accountable for violations and abuses, not only the direct perpetrators, but also superiors who are complicit in their subordinates' crimes. In addition, we recognize the necessity of a comprehensive approach when addressing the complexities surrounding the mass killings and other violations and abuses in the North Central region. Thus, we seek reliable in-country partners willing to uphold the rule of law, including inviolable limits on the exercise of government power, like the obligations to protect the rights to free expression, religion, and due process. And we want to underscore the importance of acknowledging and recognizing the irreducible and equal worth, value, and dignity of women, including the important role that women can play in building a peaceful future. Good governance requires some basic fundamentals, like an independent judiciary dispensing justice without fear or favor, a citizenry willing and able to hold its leaders accountable, and a security sector willing to hold itself accountable. We call on the government of Nigeria to investigate and prosecute the perpetrators of the attacks and killings occurring within borders, including responsible officials. The United States will continue to work tirelessly to end religion-motivated abuses and persecution around the world, including in Nigeria. We'll never cease working to help ensure that each person, everyone, at all times, has a right to live peacefully in accordance with the dictates of his or her country. In fact, we will work assiduously to end abuses and persecution of all kinds globally. We desire to work with Nigeria's governmental and civil society leaders to prevent further violence. The Secretary has made clear that we want the Nigerian people to be successful, and the religious intolerance and horrific actions occurring in Nigeria are unacceptable and must end. We recognize the necessity of a comprehensive approach to addressing mass killings in the North Central region, and that strategy must be part of a broader comprehensive strategy for Nigeria as a whole. Prioritizing good governance under the rule of law, accountability, respect for human rights, and fundamental freedoms, and other reforms are prerequisites for preventing mass atrocities, as well as establishing and maintaining peace and security. The government of Nigeria must, as a matter of highest urgency, address the humanitarian crisis in its midst. We stand ready to help if there is a serious desire government to tackle these issues. It will entail a process with benchmarks and milestones to gauge the level of commitment and to make sure each stage is dealt with systematically and comprehensively. Any other approach would not fully succeed. Thank you again for giving me the opportunity to speak to you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Tan. I really appreciate your thorough and very expert testimony. We now would like to, the Commission, welcome Secretary Destro.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman. Thank you, Representative McGovern and Representative Smith for your invitation this afternoon. It's a real honor for me to be here. And I'm sorry? Can you hear?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Sorry about that. I'd like to thank you for the invitation this afternoon, not only to the co-chairs, but to Ms. Jackson Lee and Mr. Green, who have showed up this afternoon to deal with this really important question. The Commission has my prepared remarks, and I'm going to use them as the jumping off point this afternoon for these comments. So I'm not going to repeat most of the points in there. You've had them already, but I will be happy to answer questions on anything that's said there. I'd like to begin with the very end of my comments. And that is, I'd like to reiterate a point here, or make a point here, that I think both of my colleagues, Ambassador Tan and Ambassador Brownback, have made, especially with respect to the obligation of the Nigerian government to hold perpetrators accountable. The Nigerians are our friends. They're blessed with rich traditions and a rich culture of toleration and learning. They've got incredibly talented people who are more than capable of turning their collective attention to the problems not only in their own countries, but also in the good work they're doing as our close partners in the fight against terrorism in West Africa. My job at the State Department as Assistant Secretary in DRL is to look ahead, to identify where there are serious security and human rights challenges, and to identify them and to put a plan in place to address them. Nigeria is just such a place. We're not without options here. Much needs to be done. So I would like to start with thanking my two colleagues, Ambassador Tan and Ambassador Brownback. You know, together with them and with my other colleagues in what we call the J family, the Undersecretariat for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights, we have been working hard since early April when Secretary Pompeo asked DRL to take the lead on, as he put it, making sense out of what's happening in Nigeria. As all of you have pointed out, including members of this panel, that this is a very complicated problem. It's a very complicated problem in the Northwest, in the Northeast, in the North Central, and increasingly in other parts of the country. So, and I'd also like to point out as I get started, that my comments today are informed by intensive conversations in mid-October that we had with members of Nigerian civil society, with the federal government, with state governors, and with implementers from USAID and from religious and other groups in Nigeria. I was joined on that trip, or I should say I joined the trip led by Counselor T. Elric Breckbuell and my colleague, Assistant Secretary Denise Natali of the Bureau of Conflict Stabilization Operations. And as I said, we met with quite a few people. And what was very, very clear throughout the conversations there was that the Nigerians themselves are beside themselves. There is some denial that there's religious violence, but I did not find that to be the case in most instances. You know, there is a real sense, and I think this is a movement ahead of where we have been in the past, that religion is in fact a factor in the conflict in Nigeria. We have a number of different dueling narratives going on about farmers and herders, about the ethno-religious aspects of the conflict there. There's also the larger regional conflict, which I would point out that our Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, David Hale, made in his comments about fragility in the Sahel on March 10th, 2020, you know, where he points out that terrorists enjoy freedom of movement across most of the Sahel. And so we need, as we look about what the question of what does a good outcome look like in Nigeria, and that really is the question I think we need to be focusing on here, is what is it that we, as friends of Nigeria, need to be doing to help them address the very, very serious problems that they themselves acknowledge, both public and privately. So as the co-chairs have said, Nigeria is important in its own right, if only, I should say, not if only, but precisely because we value Nigerians as partners and as people and as fellow human beings. It's the largest country in Africa. It's a key ally. It's at the center of West Africa, and its position in the Sahel makes Nigeria's security a major national security interest of the United States. This hearing offers us an opportunity, and that opportunity is to think from the outset that this is about civilian security. We have to start with civilian security because without civilian security, there is no protection for human rights. If there was one message that we got consistently from civil society organizations, from aid organizations, and from the governors themselves, was that if a community calls the Nigerian equivalent of 911, nobody answers. There is no effective police protection from the national police. The Army is overstretched. It's pulling back. The Nigerian Parliament has just recently, the National Assembly has just recently passed a community policing bill that they're going to need a lot of help in implementing. But the practical problem is that we know who the victims are, and I want to give you some recent statistics. If we focus only on the Middle Belt, or in the what's more properly called North Central, 600 people, more than 600 people have died in 2020 alone. If we open the aperture a bit more and include both North Central and Northeast and Northwest, the number goes up to an astounding 5,695 people in 2020. Those numbers are mind-boggling, and we need to do something about them. But the question is, what is it that we here in the United States, as friends and allies of Nigeria, how do we help them get the situation under control on the ground? I saw across the board, including in the government of Nigeria's response to the designation, to its designation of a country of particular concern, a very positive statement that they would be willing to work with us on a comprehensive plan to get out from underneath that designation. You know, we also so what we need to be doing here is figuring out how to develop the ground level, first of all, intelligence that is needed to do the accountability work that both Ambassador Brownback and Ambassador Tan have mentioned. The governors are largely without local police resources. There is no local police in Nigeria, and we had a governor at dinner in our last night in Abuja back in October, who literally was in tears about, he mentioned 32 people had been killed in his state in Northwest just a couple of days before. And it was said in a matter-of-fact but despairing way. We don't have the resources. We also spoke with prosecutors who don't have the resources. They sometimes don't even have the electricity to run the computers or the printers. We also spoke with governors in other parts. You know, we look at the northeastern state of Borno, where aid organizations are pulling out because it's simply too dangerous. So this question is what to do. And this, I hope that there will be some questions here. We have spent in DRL leading the Nigerian working group, which has included all the members of the J family. We have included other parts of the State Department and have been working closely with our embassy in Abuja, which for very important purposes is our point of the spear in Nigeria in terms of engaging with the government. So we're going to need to engage fully with the government of Nigeria, with the police, with the federal government, with local and state governments, with local civil society organizations, with church groups, to build an early warning network so that we can get timely information, if only to warn people before these attacks happen. We have to acknowledge, as the members of this commission have noted in their remarks, that the first responsibility for taking care of the people of Nigeria belongs to the government of Nigeria. You know, our role has been to call it like it is on the ground, to recognize that we don't have the kinds of information that we need to have. This most recent kidnapping of the young people in Katsina is a classic example of that. You know, we know that some of the children are Muslim. We know that they're mainly Hausa speaking. We know that some of the children are Christian. You know, and we know from a video that I recently just sent the committee, you know, that the video has an Islamic State flag on it. Now, I don't know what that means. We can't draw firm conclusions with respect to who did what to whom in this context, but we do know that organized criminals are terrorizing ordinary Nigerians across the country. You know, when we left, I left with a searing recollection by one of the people who met with us, who said, he says, I fear that we are on the brink of a civil war, that we are going to be, he said, and his comment was, he is a northern Christian who's living in the South. And he says, we're in a situation where we don't know who the enemy is. If there's going to be a civil war here, he says, we don't know who the enemy is. He says, if I go to the north, because they assume that I'm a Southerner, they're going to assume I'm a Christian. He says, and of course I am a Christian. He said, but he says, I'm going to be at risk in my home in the north because I'm a Christian. He says, if I go to the south, people are going to assume that I am a Muslim and I'm going to be at risk. He says, what we need is for you all to pay attention to what the controversy is here, to work with us closely on the ground, and to really develop that ground level understanding of what Nigerians need to help themselves. I can also add, from a very, very informative dinner we had with some allied ambassadors during one of the evenings we were there, there is considerable support for joint action to help the Nigerian government, to help local communities from many, many allies. We're all thinking in exactly the same way, that the Nigerian government needs help. And I rest assured that this is not something that the American government needs to do on its own. We have support. All we need to do is ask for it. And I look forward to your questions, and thank you for the opportunity to testify here today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary, for your testimony and your leadership as well. Just a few questions, and I'll do them all because there may be other members that want to, and I don't want to delay it too much, but you've really underscored that you have a robust policy. You've been implementing, you've been reaching out to the Buhari government. And again, the designation of country of particular concern was a very, very important, I think, milestone in, you warned them last year with the watch list, and this year you said we're going to go ahead. And of course, those sanctions can be waived, which I believe they have been, pending. I mean, that was the original hope of the International Religious Freedom Act, that it would compel reform and encourage reform, and our hope certainly is that it will. Your point, Mr. Secretary, about the 911 and nobody answers, again, not to overstate it, but Bishop Avenya, in his testimony, said that since the consistent attacks began 5 years ago, there has hardly been a single day gone by without killing in one part of the region or other. And then he says, no one is ever arrested or questioned or prosecuted or convicted of any charge relating to this spree of killings. Elsewhere, other who will testify today point out that these aren't conflicts or clashes. These are massacres where people come in, it's often late at night, and just kill and maim and rape. So it is horrific as to what they're doing. We all know it, but your point is very well taken. Now, years ago, on one of my trips to Abuja, we were pushing very hard that the Nigerian military, which has a very fine record of peacekeeping throughout all of Africa, as peacekeepers, and have some people who have obviously committed human rights abuses, many, many others who have not. A fusion center was established in Abuja. There was talk of training so that they could, and the catalyzing event, as you all might recall, was the kidnapping of the Chibok girls. Everybody all of a sudden became very focused on what truly was happening in Nigeria vis-a-vis Boko Haram. We then found out that the Leahy law was being used in a way that it was never intended to be used, and that is to say, oh, we really can't train all that many people. So I convened a hearing right in this hearing room, and we learned from the administration itself, it was the Obama administration, that maybe half or more of the troops could be trained with human rights training and counterinsurgency and the like to track down Boko Haram and hopefully end their killing spree. My question is, we need to be sure that a new package of engagement does not get mired in, I mean, the Leahy Law, I support it. I think it's great that we never want to be training somebody who has committed atrocities, but in like fashion, we don't want to have a chilling effect on training, so it doesn't happen at all. So you might want to speak to how a training component could go forward, police as well as for the military. Secondly, and thank you for relaying back to us how the Buhari government has responded to the CPC designation, that they want to talk, they want to, engage, and I think that's a good sign. But, the ICC, several years ago, we all remember it, did an investigation and found out in 2013, and matter of fact, Ms. Bawalda, in her testimony from the Jubilee campaign, and I remember she was here in 2012 when we were raising these issues, but she points out that the UN Special Rapporteur points out that in 2013, the ICC released its Article 5 report, which they concluded that there was, quote, insufficient evidence to investigate crimes against humanity by the Fulani militants in Nigeria. So my question there would be, this ICC investigation, as you understand it, maybe Ambassador Tan, you might want to speak to this. Are they looking at the Fulani too? There was evidence then, but hopefully that evidence will not be either overlooked or not properly assessed, because they did claim that they were not, there was insufficient evidence. So I would, if you could, on that one. The Genocide Convention, which Nigeria signed in 2009, if this isn't a genocide, and Nina Shea and other witnesses make those points very clearly, as does Ms. Bawalda, that this is a genocide that's happening right before our eyes. As we all know, how hard it was, and Ambassador Brownback knows how hard it was to get the proclamation that a genocide was happening in Darfur. Many were very reluctant to admit that, that's what that was. And we know what's going on, as you know, Sam, so well, and the others, against the Muslim Uyghurs right now in China by Xi Jinping. So the question is there thought being given to trying to bring an action before the genocide treaty body at the United Nations vis-a-vis this horrible killing that's going on? And finally, Nina Shea makes this recommendation. I make it. I think a lot of us believe that using the Magnitsky Act, the Global Magnitsky Act, would be a very useful tool to designate certain individuals who are committing these atrocities, those who are, the definition of the law, and apply it. I'll never forget Bashir. We all know this. When he was indicted by the ICC, that had an impact. It had an impact on his country. It had an impact on him. I've met with him before he was indicted for that. And frankly, all he wanted to talk about was getting rid of sanctions. So sanctions do work. They take time often. But the Magnitsky Act, it seems to me, is a tool that I respectfully would hope that you're considering, and I'm sure you are considering even now. So any of our three distinguished witnesses, if you might want to speak to those points.
Perhaps I will start if Ambassador Brownback and Assistant Secretary Destro don't want to go first. But if either of you want to jump in first, I'm willing to yield.
Well,
no, go ahead.
And Ambassador Tan, in your answer,
go ahead,
any
Ambassador
idea?
Tan, and then I'll come up at the end here.
Okay. So thank you, Chairman Smith, for so many great insights, for your commitment to these issues over the course of, I believe you said 8 hearings, and all the work that you've done with respect to Nigeria and around the world.
Ms. Jackson Lee,
I'm sorry, what was that?
could you mute your? We're waiting
Yes,
for
it looks
Ambassador
muted
Tan.
now.
Okay. But we don't have a visual of you, Mr. Ambassador. Mr. Ambassador Tan.
I see my own video on the screen. I'm not sure what needs to be done in order to.
It's working. It's fine. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Is it working?
Yes, sir. It is.
Okay, great. Yeah, I do want to thank you for all the great work that you've done. We have indications, and I appreciate, first of all, what A.S. Destro was saying in regards to what an important friend and ally Nigeria is. Nothing that I was saying before, nor anything that I'm saying now, should diminish or in any way deprecate that important friendship and alliance. And we say all that we're saying as allies and friends, but we do have indications of corruption, whether in the legal system, whether it's judges, whether it's attorneys, whether it's in the security sector. We have reports of instances of collusion on the part of some within the military as well. And so these are greatly concerning, and I think that's one of the things that needs to be addressed in order for justice to be able to move forward, certainly domestically. There are other possibilities in terms of other justice mechanisms that can be pursued, that my Office of Global Criminal Justice has pursued in all sorts of different contexts, in all sorts of different places and times, whether it's a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, whether it is a hybrid tribunal that's part domestic, part international, that could help to address any justice gap that exists in terms of many times those who are most responsible for the worst mass atrocities. But the government itself and leadership within Nigeria have the first and primary and indeed best opportunities to be able to do so. My understanding is that there are many local leaders that are eager, that are willing, that are wanting there to be a greater addressing of the justice gap that currently exists. And we applaud that. We want to partner together with those who are willing to do so. And so these are a few things from the GCJ angle that is hopefully at least a little bit responsive to what you were talking about. Thank you.
If I could jump in here, Chairman, I think that Magnitsky's suggestions is a good one. As you noted, when the Secretary Pompeo made the determination of a country of particular concern on Nigeria, this is the first time that this has happened on Nigeria. They were special watch list last year, which was the first time for them. They didn't improve. Things got worse. The government didn't respond. We tried to get them to act. They didn't. So the Secretary put them a country of particular concern, but he waived the sanctions at that time under national interest, and also I think probably as a way of just continuing to try to ratchet up the notice to the Nigerian government that things are not going right here. You need to change course. And I believe this is the first democracy that we've ever put in as a country of particular concern as well. So I mean that's a new one as well. But that doesn't mean that there won't be sanctions following in the future. In another administration, they may look at it, and if things don't improve, then put in overall sanctions. That's separate and apart from the Magnitsky, which can be done individually, and is a very useful sanctioning tool. I've seen some other countries. The UK has added a global Magnitsky type of sanction regime, and I wouldn't doubt that there will be discussions. There have been discussions about various countries what to do on Nigeria because it affects so many. We've got an International Religious Freedom Alliance now of 32 nations, and we're raising the issue of Nigeria amongst that alliance of what to do there. So these things are going to be discussed. One final thought I would put out there is that there's been recently, this past, about a year ago, we started an Abrahamic faith initiative of global theologians within the Abrahamic faith, from Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, to discuss the use of religion for peace, not war. There are too many people on the ground in Nigeria wanting to use religion as a tool of war. And my hope is we can get some top theologians from around the world, from the various Abrahamic faiths, into Nigeria to talk about religion as the instrument of peace. So we don't just concede this ground to the terrorist groups to say we're going to use religion as a tool of war. Religion at its heart is peaceful. And I really think we need to get a counter narrative in there. And I hope the Nigerian government will work with that piece as well. And there are obviously security needs in other places too, of issues that need to be addressed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes. And I know, Secretary Destro, you tried on the Abrahamic faith type initiative, because I know you invited a few of us to meet with friends, Muslims, leaders, clerics, and I think Sam Brownback's point, the ambassador's point, is very well taken, that that the faiths become a catalyst for peace. So thank you for your past work on that as well.
Well, thank you. Let me address a couple of the questions that you raised. Let me address the Leahy question specifically. As I've tried to say, the issue of what the United States should be doing. I apologize for the dogs barking in the background, but what the United States should be doing is a whole of government effort. We will be engaging. We have a very active security and human rights office in DRL that is looking at what does a really affirmative Leahy diplomacy look like. We work very closely and will be working closely as time wears on with our Bureau of Political and Military Affairs. I mean, this is a whole of the State Department, and I would suggest a whole of government initiative, because we can't, engage effectively with the Nigerian military without also getting our friends from the Pentagon involved in that discussion. So as these plans develop, that engagement's going to happen at multiple levels at one time. I also wanted to address the point that my friend and colleague Ambassador Tan pointed out about the lack of capacity. I mean, we noted in many of our conversations with Nigerian civil society organizations that one of them, and I quote, he says, "I get really concerned when foreigners like yourselves talk about the situation in Nigeria as being complicated." He says, "It's not complicated." He says, "We just don't hold people accountable." To which one of his colleagues at the luncheon pointed out, she says, "Yes, petty criminals get punished, but nobody else does." So we have a real, uphill climb. But at the end of the day, many Nigerians, one of the polls show that many Nigerians are very worried about being kidnapped for ransom. I mean, that is a profound human rights problem, and it's one that I think they certainly are focused on the issue. I think that as Representative Jackson Lee pointed out, we have a huge Nigerian diaspora population in this country, very talented people with whom we should be working on how best to engage across the board. And I think we have a consensus in Nigeria, and we have a consensus here and among our allies that a lot of work needs to be done. The question is, how do we best go about doing it, and let the Nigerians take the lead in the process? But I think we're there to be friends. You know, our embassy has some very, very talented people, and I think we are well represented on the ground, and should be getting started yesterday. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Commissioner Jackson Lee, she's now coming in virtually.
Yes, Chairman.
All
Can
right,
you hear
thank
me?
Perfectly. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for yielding to me, and thank you to the three witnesses, of whom all of them have given potent and very vital information. I want to reinforce the fact that the diaspora of Nigerians are dynamic, and Nigerian Americans across the gamut, if I might, from something that is popular in the United States, outstanding athletes, many of them pro athletes, many of them I have in my own jurisdiction, and many obviously know Akeem Olajuwon and many others who have excelled on behalf of the United States. Then, of course, many in the medical field and science and education. We're absolutely blessed to have them, and they are committed and dedicated to Nigeria. But Nigeria itself is blessed, as I said earlier, with a multiple amount of resources, even agrarian, even with the disputes with the herders and the farmers. There is much opportunity in Nigeria. So I want to put this number on the record again from the Statistical Risk Assessment that says Nigeria as a whole faces a 7.3% risk of experiencing a new mass killing by the end of 2021, making it the 6th highest in the world. I think that is a stark number that goes alongside of the idea of being killed because of your religion or because of your profession, farmer or herder, or being killed because of the absence of the government. So I want to raise this question with Ambassador Brownback, Ambassador Tan. And Ambassador Tan, I really, as an expert in criminal justice, I happen to be senior member on the subcommittee on crime on judiciary and spent a lot of time on international terrorism and other issues. But I want you to answer from the perspective of the issue of crime. And then to Ambassador Assistant Secretary Destro. So I'll start with Ambassador Brownback. The question is, what is the Nigerian government not doing? What has the Nigerian government not paid attention to legislatively? Dr. King said, I may not be able to change hearts, but I can change laws. My opening remark says that the government, to my understanding and belief, we have President Buhari. I've known all the presidents for the last 20 years plus. President Buhari has recently been elected. He is a Muslim. Why has there not been any effective government interaction on behalf of its own citizens who stand one after another to be kidnapped for ransom, to be killed, to have boys who are trying to go to school taken, to have girls who are trying to go to school taken and their virginity taken away from them? So what is it that they are not doing, or what are they doing? Ambassador Brownback?
It's a great and very direct question that most of us have been asking the Nigerian government to act more aggressively, to bring to account the people that are committing these crimes. When I toured and traveled to Nigeria and met with government officials and individuals in the society, they'd saying all these crimes are happening and nobody's ever brought to justice. They're not prosecuted. They're not providing security for their own people. You could go to many areas and find villages that had been just attacked and targeted, and no police there, and no response. And then you get these communal reprisal acts that happen. People offer, some other places offer help, and then it's not accepted by the Nigerian government. And then there just seems to be either this lack of will or ability or both to address what we deem to be a growing and very in a bad problem. And that if it gets out of control, you could see really a number of other additional things take place. So that's why, the secretary, I believe, put them as a country of particular concern this year because they tolerated the situation. It wasn't as much of government action, but it was inaction and tolerating these terrible circumstances that we need the Nigerians to get more aggressive to respond to.
Thank you. Ambassador Tan?
Yes, thank you, Representative and Commissioner Jackson Lee. Really appreciate your concern and how you are seeking to address these matters. There is a gap between the existing laws that are domestically in place, not to mention the ones that exist internationally as well. An example would be the Corrupt Practices and Other Related Offenses Act of 2000. But there has to be the implementation of these laws, the execution of these laws, the enforcement of these laws. And as Assistant Secretary Destro had mentioned, the police are federal. There are no local police. And perhaps that is something that can help if there could be the building up and supporting of local police that are there. And so if laws are not implemented, if they're not enforced, if they're not going into practice, then they become dead letter and they are unable to have the sort of force that Dr. King, as you were alluding to earlier. Law at its best can be a tremendous teacher. It can help people to understand what are the parameters within which society should operate. And it can also be a tremendous moral guide. But if they are lying dormant, if they are not being implemented sufficiently, then they cannot have the majestic force and effect that they are intended to have. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. Assistant Secretary, let me frame the question in this way, which is, as I indicated, and President Buhari has recently been elected. He is a Muslim. And the North has been a continuing concern. It has been represented that the North feels completely isolated and disrespected with no resources from the national government coming. And then, of course, it trickles into Middle Belt and elsewhere. But there has to be some diplomacy with President Buhari. I know that he was here visiting some months ago, and their legislative branch, where, the question of sanctions, they're acted upon, they accept the sanctions, and they do nothing. There has to be a way that President Buhari and our diplomacy really represents our concern about this constant brutality, these rising numbers, the potential of mass murder. And I know there's a second panel. What does the government, from your perspective, need to do? What laws does President Buhari need to present to the legislature from his administration, asking his party to work on that, to show concern? I think there is something about being the federal police. And of course, we've had Nigerian Americans complain about the police activities in places like Lagos. I want to see safety, education, protecting children, and ceasing the sectarian violence. Mr. Secretary?
Thank you very much for the question. It's really a great question, and it's one of the most perhaps one of the most intellectually difficult ones. Let me start with an observation made by a very senior federal official the first day we were there. He says, and I quote, "It is impossible that religion is a factor in these conflicts." And you just kind of sit there and think, well, wait a minute, I'll concede that it's one of the factors, and perhaps a very important one. But the idea that it's impossible means that there's a certain amount of denial that's going on. And I know that the Nigerian government was not happy with the message that we delivered on any number of occasions while we were there. It was made very, very clear that the federal government was not happy with the message. By contrast, the state governors were like, "What can you do to help us?" I mean, this is and I want you to imagine the people of your own district who would have to call Washington to get help. I mean, we don't have effective local police departments, and the National Assembly has passed a law on local policing, but it's going to have to be built from the ground up. And then lastly, I think right now, I think the most effective thing we can be doing is engaging with state and local authorities and with state and local groups, because they need the information. They need active ground level intelligence to be able to protect themselves. I mean, people have cell phones. People live in remote areas. Right now, there's not a good early warning system on the ground. That's one of the tasks that was set by Congress in the Elie Wiesel Act, the Atrocities Early Warning and Prevention Act. So we've been considering all these possible tools, and I can assure you that we will be engaging on every level with President Buhari's government. But they've got to want to change, and I think the state and local folks do want some help, and I think we're in a position with our allies across the world to help them do that.
Okay, so the practice.
Let me thank you on that. I think the commission is probably one of the tools that can be utilized to try and make statements to bring all these elements together. Clearly, I think the government has to be engaged, either legally. I think if we continue to render sanctions, they're just accepted. And the people are still suffering, and a mass murder will occur, and children are still being kidnapped. So I thank you. All of these moving parts need to be together. The governor of the states, the gubernatorial representatives of these states, they're almost like many countries that we need to engage as well. And we're looking forward for ways to legislatively here be helpful, but also to work internationally. And thank you so very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Thank you, Commissioner. I'd like to now yield to Mr. Green of Texas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I greatly appreciate and thank the witnesses for appearing with us today, all of them. Mr. Chairman and witnesses, I have one question. I'm very much concerned that the House of Representatives will have a voice in this issue that can be published. And to this end, I have a resolution that is pending in the Foreign Affairs Committee. But my question has to do with simply this: how important is it for the House of Representatives to go on record by way of a resolution? And how would this resolution possibly influence circumstances, maybe not the Nigerians themselves, but others who may be have concern as it relates to the issues concerning life and death? I know that the Nigerian community in this country would greatly appreciate the House passing a resolution that addresses these atrocities. And I'm curious, from the point of view of two ambassadors, as to how this would impact others, and whether you would think that it would be appropriate for us to do such a thing. So I'll start with Ambassador Brownback. If you would give your comments, please.
Yes, Congressman Green, I think it's very helpful if the House of Representatives puts a resolution forward. You know, I used to put those in when I was in the Senate, and you know, at times I would kind of wonder, are we really doing any good? But what I found was this is the voice of the people of the United States, and it does resonate, and it gets a lot of press in these other countries, and it kind of pushes that government because they get embarrassed. What's the House of Representatives doing talking about us? Well, they're talking about us because we got a big problem here. So these things are very helpful in my estimation, and I hope they move on forward.
Thank you so very much. And Ambassador Tan, please.
Congressman Green, I applaud your desire to put forward this resolution. I think it does make a difference. And it is, as Ambassador Brownback has said, you are the representatives of our people. And when this voice goes forth, I think it matters and makes a difference. So I very much applaud and would want to only encourage this resolution to move forward. I have not seen the text of the resolution, and if it could be a broad enunciation of the concerns of the House, I think that would be potentially a helpful step here. So thank you for your efforts along these lines. But from what I gather, it sounds like there are helpful things that I can hear being included, and would look forward to it being a broad enunciation of the concerns of the House. Thank you.
I thank you very much. And I'll move to Assistant Secretary Destro, please.
Thank you, Mr. Green. You know, I want to underscore what my colleagues have said about the important role that you, as the representatives of our people, play in this discussion. Not only is the collective voice of the House important, but I think your individual voice in reaching out across these parliamentary boundaries to speaking to your colleagues in Nigeria will give you a very, very good sense of what they see the constraints on their own action might be. They can say those things to you in private, just as governors can say things to us in private. And I really do hope that in addition to your collective wisdom in the House on these issues, that you will actively reach out to your Nigerian counterparts with your colleagues to get a real good sense of what I have been calling that ground level intelligence about what's needed and what the barriers are. Thank you, sir.
Well, thank you, and I greatly appreciate your recommendation. It is duly noted, and I assure you that I'll do some follow through with it. In my closing comment, I would ask that all of the other witnesses who will give their testimony at a later time, if they would kindly address the question of the resolution or a resolution, and whether or not it should be passed by the House of Representatives. I think it's important that we get some sense from people who have a good understanding of what's going on, not that that our members don't, but a good understanding of what's going on so that they can be on the record helping us to move things forward if you believe that it's appropriate for it to move forward, some sort of resolution. And finally, Mr. Chairman, I can never thank you enough for this hearing. The people in my congressional district are watching today, and I know that they are very much pleased that this is taking place. They have been engaging in protestations. They have made their voices heard as loudly as they can from the perch that they occupy. I think this amplifies their voices. It lets them know that they're being heard and that we care about the things that are happening in Nigeria. So again, I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I will yield back the balance of the time that you have allowed me. Thank you so much.
Mr. Green, thank you very much. And I want to thank our very distinguished panelists. We do have some additional questions. I and others will submit them for the record, just in the interest of time. We do have a number of other witnesses to panel 2 awaiting. But thank you for your leadership. Thank you for your boldness. My hope is that all of our hopes, both sides of the aisle, is that what you have done, particularly with the CPC designation most recently, will bear significant fruit and hopefully begin ending this savagery that's happening, which obviously the Fulani is not just the most recent, they've been doing it for a long time, but it's much more visible and much more virulent right now. So thank you again for your testimony and for your leadership. I'd like to now introduce our private panel, our second panel. And beginning, he was on the line, but we just lost him, but hopefully we can get him back on the line. Our first witness is, and hopefully will be very shortly, His Excellency Bishop William Avenya, the Bishop of Koboko, Nigeria. He's a bishop who was ordained a priest on May 30th of 1981. He has been an extraordinarily compassionate, brave, and tenacious religious leader. He has spoken out both in Nigeria, of course, where he resides and lives and is a leader among his own diocese, but for all of Nigeria. We read his comments over and over again as he comments on the need for true engagement. So we look forward to having him as soon as we can make that connection. Then we will hear from Baroness Cox, who was created a life peer in 1982 and was a deputy speaker of the House of Lords from 1985 to 2005. She was founder chancellor of Bournemouth University, chancellor of Liverpool Hope University from 2006 to 2013, and vice president of the Royal College of Nursing. She is founder and CEO of HEART, Humanitarian Aid Relief Trust. Her humanitarian work takes her to conflict and post-conflict zones, including the Armenian enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh, Sudan, South Sudan, Nigeria, Uganda, Syria, and the Shan and Shin regions of Burma. She has visited North Korea to promote parliamentary initiatives and medical programs. Most germane to our hearing, she is the co-chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for International Freedom of Religion or Belief, which conducted an excellent report on the conflict in Nigeria, which I asked to be included without objection to the record. Then we will hear from Anne Bawalda, who is the executive director of the Jubilee Campaign USA, focusing on international religious freedom, advocating for the release of prisoners of conscience and resettlement of refugees, combating trafficking and for the protection of children, and providing support for victims. In March of 1996, Anne Bawalda founded the law firm Just Law International, PC, a firm handling all aspects of immigration law, including asylum and refugee cases. She served as an adjunct professor teaching immigration law at Regent University in 1996 and teaching international religious freedom law in 2011. She has testified before the Africa and Human Rights Subcommittee on the plight of refugees, and we are very happy to welcome her back. We'll then hear from Nina Shea, who founded the Hudson Institute's Center for Religious Freedom and is expert in international religious freedom issues, including how it pertains to U.S. foreign policy, religious minorities, women's rights, terrorism, anti-Semitism, and free speech. She has worked as a nonprofit lawyer, specifically focusing on issues concerning religious freedom and freedom of expression in American foreign policy for over 30 years. She joined Hudson Institute as a senior fellow in 2006, and she directs the Center for Religious Freedom, an entity she founded in 1986. She is also well known to the Lantos Commission and was a witness at a hearing over the summer with respect to religious persecution in the People's Republic of China. We'll then hear from Mike Jobins, who is Vice President of Global Affairs and Partnerships at Search for Common Ground, an international conflict transformation organization supporting 120 peace-building efforts throughout Africa, Asia, Europe, the Middle East, and North America. For the past 12 years, he has developed and managed crisis response, conflict resolution, and inclusive governance programs, including in Nigeria and the Sahel. Mr. Jobins is well known to us as well And he testified at a hearing that I had chaired on the Central African Republic, with fears that that conflict might there turn into a genocide as well. We'll then hear from Udo Jude Ilo, who is a Nigerian representative for the Open Society Initiative for West Africa. In the last 17 years, Udo has worked as a change agent, engaging government on issues related to elections, human rights, and good governance, and working with citizens to promote knowledge and enhance their capacity to demand reforms. He has published 10 works and more than 50 op-eds, the spans of critical governance that affect Africa. He is part of the 2016 cohort of the Eisenhower Fellowship and also a Stanford Draper Hills Fellow. So, okay. We're still trying to make the connection or reconnect with the bishop, but if Baroness Cox, I hope you're online, if you could give us the insights and the benefit of your wisdom.
Well, thank you all very much for the great privilege of speaking about our experience of Nigeria over many years. I'd like to congratulate the US State Department for designating Nigeria as a country of particular concern under the International Religious Freedom Act. And it's also encouraging the International Criminal Court has called for an inquiry into war crimes and crimes against humanity in Nigeria. These are much needed recognitions of the horrific situation with terror, thousands of killings, abductions, atrocities, loss of loved ones, homes and livelihoods on a massive scale, as we've heard, in the northern states, Central Belt, and is now moving further south. As CEO of Humanitarian Aid Relief Trust, I've had the painful privilege of visiting many times some of the worst affected areas and have heard directly from survivors of attacks. They have shared with immense bravery and with tears their personal tragedies. As pictures speak louder than words and stay long after many words disappear, I wish to invite you to spend just a few minutes traveling with me to meet one or two of the people and see examples of the destruction inflicted on their communities. So I'd love to show a brief PowerPoint, if I may, and thank very much the competence of the staff here. The theory is Nigeria, Unfolding Genocide. That is the title of the all-party parliamentary group on Nigeria, which was published earlier this year. Next slide, please. Just examples of the tragic statistics. Since 2020, Boko Haram killed 43,000. Islamist Fulani killed 19,000. So I thought it should be 2015, I'm sorry. Since June 2015, 12,000 Christians have been killed, 2,000 churches burnt. January to June this year, in southern Kaduna, 300 Christians have been massacred, and many more since then. And May this year, 350 Igbo villages occupied by Fulani herders and Shuwa Arab mercenaries. And the figures have increased enormously since then, including in recent weeks, as we've already heard. Next slide, please. Just to meet some of the people and see the situations. This is a church in Kaduna State, and I'm afraid it could be an example of so many churches destroyed. This was a town in Kaduna State where there were 3 churches, the Roman Catholic Church, the Anglican and Ekwa. They were all destroyed like this. Next slide, please. And this is a village also in Middle Belt, and 4 villages have been attacked. You see the destruction behind. Many had to flee, but those who couldn't flee were left there. This is a pastor who stayed back to look after the ones who couldn't flee, but they were living in perpetual danger. Next slide, please. And in the same village, the pastor was killed in his own home. This is the remains of his home, and it makes one feel extremely humble standing in the home of someone who's recently died for their faith, as so many thousands have in Nigeria. Next slide, please. And this is an example of a typical destruction of a village or a small town, everything destroyed, homes, shops, nothing left. Next slide, please. And this is an example of the kind of atrocities perpetrated over and above the massacres and the killings. This young lady, Veronica, she tried to run away when her village was attacked by the Fulani. She ran with her 6-year-old daughter, but they ran into a group of Islamist Fulani who were surrounding the village. They surrounded her and her daughter. They slashed her on the neck and shoulder with a machete. I've seen the scars. And then they said, your daughter would love to suck her mother's finger. So as you see, they amputated her forefinger and she passed out. And when she came round, her little 6-year-old daughter was lying dead next to her with her mother's finger stuck into her mouth. You can't put this down to climate change. These are atrocities with an intent to perpetrate terror. Next slide, please. And just hugging, what else can you do in situations like that? Next slide, please. And this is a mass grave in another village. All the men in the village who were caught were slaughtered, and we're just paying our tribute at the mass grave together with the bishop of that particular part of Kaduna State. Next slide, please. And drawing to an end, this is a statement from Archbishop Ben Kwashi, the Archbishop in Plateau State, based in Jos. He says, if we have a faith worth living for, it's a faith worth dying for. Don't you, that's us, compromise the faith that they are living and dying for. They are living and dying for their faith, and the responsibility must be with us to make sure that the killings and the massacres and the gross humanitarian atrocities are called to account, which is why I'm so pleased about the most recent developments. We can come out of PowerPoint, please. May I just return for a few closing words? Similar harrowing testimonies were considered in detail in the report to the UK Foreign Secretary last year by the Bishop of Truro, in which he concluded, reports consistently showed that in Nigeria, month after month, on average, hundreds of Christians were being killed for reasons connected with their faith. Those worst affected included Christian women and girls abducted, forced to convert, enter forced marriage, sexual abuse, and torture. I would like, if I'm with permission, to make that report available following this meeting as a source of information. And I and many colleagues in the UK Parliament have frequently sought to raise these serious concerns with UK government with questions, debates, evidence to inquiries, and recently by the publication of a report which reference has already been made by the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Freedom of Religion and Belief, and it was entitled, saw earlier, Nigeria Unfolding Genocide, ? That report records thousands of civilians who've been killed in attacks led by Islamist Fulani militia and periodic retaliatory violence. And if I may, I'd like to submit that for the record, as well as the report of our most recent visit. So drawing to a conclusion, to date, UK government's response has been woefully inadequate, I'm sorry to say. Even as militant groups such as Boko Haram and Islamic State West Africa Province sweep across the Sahel, imposing their radical ideologies with violence on those who refuse to comply, and that includes Muslims as well as Christians. UK government appears to underplay the scale of the massacres. They put it down to climate change or desertification. Well, they may be factors, but they refuse to acknowledge that a possible genocide may be occurring. And the Nigerian government also has been seriously remiss in protecting its civilians and bringing perpetrators of killings to account, as we have already heard. So I conclude saying that at present, the reports of killings and abductions continue, as we again already heard, just in the last few days. But the two initiatives by the United States and the International Criminal Court may bring perpetrators of genocidal activities to account and bring, at long last, some light to the people of Nigeria at the end of a very long tunnel of suffering and potential genocide. Thank you for letting me share the pain and the passion.
Thank you so very much, Baroness Cox, for your lifelong leadership, but for your great work in Nigeria. It benefits this commission tremendously, and your full statement and materials will be made a part of the record to share with members of both the House and the Senate. So thank you so very, very much for that. We do have Father Clement Epior on the line. The bishop was pulled away. He hopefully may come back, but we do have Father Clement who will now speak on behalf of the bishop. Thank you.
Good evening, and thanks for this opportunity. Greetings to you and peace from the Nigeria's Middle Belt. Not intending rather to downplay the magnitude of the atrocities and mass killings in other parts of the country, especially in the north, it is depressing that our Middle Belt region has truly become a vale of tears, a region where mass burials are very common. It appears as though what is happening here is part of a grand conspiracy. Our national government has not shown convincing signs of recommitment to ending the menace. In fact, its complacency makes it additionally difficult for any critical mind to exonerate it of any possible involvement. How can one explain a scenario where as many as 100 innocent and defenseless villagers are killed in one single attack and no one says anything about it? Since the consistent attacks began some 5 years ago, there has hardly been a single day gone without killing in one part of the region or the other. And this is no exaggeration. In fact, one cannot give the accurate figures of those who have been killed since the beginning of these atrocities. Interestingly, no one has ever been arrested or questioned or convicted of any charge relating to this spree of killings. Yet, these killers are not invisible, neither are they unknown. Instead, these atrocities, which are actually attacks, direct, unprovoked attacks, are made to look as though they were ethnic or communal clashes. Besides, there is a high probability that the killings have a religious undertone. The targeted victims give a clear index to the religious connotation of this carnage. Also, the absolute impunity and the unchallenged audacity with which these acts are committed creates a feeling that it is a premeditated and pre-planned onslaught against the targeted populations and regions, especially when this is considered in the context of historical developments. It appears that the system has not only permitted, but is also aiding the enthronement of supremacist views of one religious group against the others. The mass slaughter of Christians in Nigeria's Middle Belt, by every standard, meets the criteria for a calculated genocide from the definition of the Genocide Convention as acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, as well as the other available facts. These atrocities have inflicted deep mental, psychological, physical, and economic injuries on the affected families, individuals, and communities. I am grateful to the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission for this platform to let the world know about the atrocities being perpetrated on the peace-loving people of Nigeria's Middle Belt. As a body that can amplify our anguish and influence the needed attention to our plight, we appeal that you project the reality and the magnitude of our groans to the world. Even if in the end nothing is done, at least it will be on record that we cried out for help, but the world was negligent of our groaning. Once again, thank you very much on behalf of His Excellency for this opportunity. Have a very good evening.
Thank you, Father Apior, for that very powerful statement from the Bishop. It is sobering, it is challenging, and we have to respond to it. So I thank you so very, very much. I'd like to now ask Mrs. Ann Bawalda from the Jubilee Campaign, the Executive Director, if she could provide her testimony.
Thank you, Congressman Smith and Congressman McGovern, for this opportunity to testify today in this vitally important Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission hearing. And I also thank Congresswoman Lee and Congressman Green for your active engagement concerning stopping the violence in Nigeria. To your question regarding a House resolution, yes, Congressman Green, I support a well-tailored and clear resolution along the lines that you stated. The focus of the U.S. government and foreign policy must remain focused on this topic. The facts are incontrovertible that the standards of crimes against humanity and genocide are increasingly being met on a daily basis in certain Middle Belt and in certain northern states of Nigeria. Islamic militant groups such as Boko Haram and ISWAP have wreaked havoc for years, with violence against civilians increasing exponentially over the past decade. My organization, Jubilee Campaign, recently submitted a brief to the International Criminal Court in which we articulated why we believe that genocidal acts are occurring nearly on a daily basis in parts of Nigeria, perpetrated by Fulani militants, and we request that that be also submitted for the record to this hearing.
Without objection.
My organization, thank you. My organization, Jubilee Campaign, welcomes the State Department's designation of Nigeria as a country of particular concern and the International Criminal Court's decision to open a formal investigation into the situation of crimes against humanity in Nigeria. We'd like them to take the further step and consider reviewing it under genocide. Both decisions occurring within the last 2 weeks are very strategic. However, we would additionally ask that more consideration be proffered to a relevant and imminent threat in the region, the rising frequency of deadly midnight attacks on predominantly Christian farming communities in Nigeria, which are carried out by groups heavily armed, radical Islamist Fulani militants. Jubilee Campaign joins NGOs around the world in the continuous call for international efforts to end the violence in Nigeria and hold all perpetrators to account, which must include anyone committing acts of violence. What we are witnessing right now is a massive humanitarian crisis, one that has the potential to leave a lasting stain on all humanity. My additional remarks provide specific statistics. Suffice it to say, since 2001, over 60,000 Nigerian civilians have died in the Middle Belt conflict violence. And according to the Global Terrorist Index, between 2012 and 2016, Fulani extremist militants killed over 2,500 Nigerians. Of course, acquiring perfectly accurate casualty figures remains difficult due to the formidable challenges of evidence gathering on the ground. However, I would like to briefly lay out some of the most pertinent facts in the last 10 years. As Congressman Smith noted from my testimony, in 2013, the International Criminal Court of the Prosecutor Office of the Prosecutor released its Article 5 report, in which they concluded that there was insufficient evidence to investigate crimes against humanity by Fulani militants in Nigeria. We are seeking to overcome this finding with the facts from victim communities. By 2014, Nigeria had experienced a 300,000 percent increase in terrorist activities since the previous year. ACLED reported that in 2014, Fulani militants attacks resulted in 1,376 deaths. In just a year, the Fulani militants went from being never previously featured among the most deadly terrorist groups to being recognized as the fourth most deadly terrorist group of 2014. In March 2015, Fulani militants engaged in the 17th worst terrorist attack in the world for that year. They attacked the predominantly Christian Egba village in Benue State, killing 82. By 2016, Fulani militants were responsible for more Nigerian civilian attacks and deaths than Boko Haram. From February 22nd to 26th, Fulani militants pillaged the predominantly Christian Agatu community in Benue State and killed over 300 men, women, and children. Survivors described horrific atrocities in these massacres. It's simply no moral equivalency for slaughtering women, men, and children with the death and making that equivalent to the death of cattle. In 2018, the International Displacement Monitoring Center observed that the conflict in the Middle Belt was 6 times deadlier than in 2018 by the Boko Haram insurgency. The violence is definitively escalating. In 2020, the data became even more staggering. In May, a local Nigerian NGO by the name of International Society for Civil Liberties and Rule of Law released a report stating that jihadist Fulani herdsmen accounted for 6,000 Christian deaths between January 2009 and December 2014, a period of 6 years. And from January 2015 to December 2020, the jihadist Fulani militants must have accounted for nearly 9,000 Christian deaths. That's 1,500 per year. That's staggering. Also in 2020, the International Committee on Nigeria, or ICON, released its report, Nigeria's Silent Slaughter, in which they revealed their calculations based upon primary sources on the ground that since 2015, Fulani militant attacks are exponentially increasing. Between 2010 and 14, the Fulani militants conducted 615 separate attacks, killing 7,551 Nigerian individuals. And between 2015 and 2020, they conducted 1,289 attacks, more than double, causing 9,733 casualties. I wanted to go through these statistics to demonstrate and show that the violence is escalating, and I'm referencing the violence by Fulani herdsmen. Now, our organization has pointed out that these statistics are in contravention and are showing that they are becoming clearly within the definition of acts of genocide. Groups of Fulani militants have engaged in virtually every one of the following acts that are part of the Genocide Convention: murder, extermination, deportation of or forcible transfer of populations, torture, rape, persecution against a group or political, racial, national, ethnic, cultural, religious, gender, or other grounds, enforced disappearances of persons, and other inhumane acts. Similarly, the standards of genocides have also been met, including killing members of a group, causing serious bodily, mental, or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Now, Jubilee Campaign submits our detailed brief for the record, and we also want to point out, for the sake of time, that we are submitting our recommendations. We would like to recommend that there be a special envoy appointed on Nigeria. We'd also like to recommend that the United Nations Commission of Inquiry to focus on examining the atrocities that have taken place in Nigeria and ensure that impunity ends. We believe that without the concentrated focus of the international community, as well as the United States, the UK, other international agencies, that this will continue and it must stop. The midnight massacres of women, men, and children must end in Nigeria. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so very much, Ms. Bawalda, I should say, for your expert testimony, the information that you've conveyed for years. When I had my 2012 hearing, I was quoting you about the Boko Haram and the impunity that they were operating under and committing atrocities with no pushback. So your commitment has been so long-standing and greatly, greatly appreciated. I'd like to now yield such time as she may consume to Nina Shea, also a long-standing hero in the area of human rights.
Co-Chairman Smith. Thank you, Co-Chairman Smith and McGovern, for holding this important and timely hearing. Only last week, the State Department made a significant policy shift on Nigeria regarding its religious freedom record. And I want to congratulate Ambassador Brownback for helping to bring this about, making Nigeria a CPC, for engaging or tolerating egregious human rights violations. It is now one of 10, of only 10, a short list of the world's worst religious abusers. Indeed, in multiple areas, that country is becoming engulfed by violence and mayhem from various sources, not least a rapidly spreading Islamist extremism. We are still reeling from the dreadful news of the abduction of over 300 middle school boys on December 11th in Nigeria's Katsina state, apparently by the terror group Boko Haram. This atrocity is the latest example of mass attacks against tens of thousands of innocent civilians in northern and middle areas of Nigeria by several groupings of Islamic extremists. Their kidnapping follows a pattern of large-scale kidnappings of school children. There are still 112 predominantly Christian Chibok schoolgirls who remain captive after almost 7 years. There's also Leah Sharibu, who rather than renounce her Christian faith is suffering the same fate following a 2018 mass kidnapping in Dapchi of 110 mostly Muslim schoolgirls, all of whom but Leah were released. In addition to being an alarming sign of Boko Haram's reach in Western Nigeria, this latest case is distinct in that its students include Muslims, albeit ones who reject the extremist views of Boko Haram. Like so many of the Muslims in that area, they reject this view. In claiming responsibilities for the attack, Boko Haram leader Shekau explained in a video, quote, "What happened in Katsina was done to promote Islam and discourage un-Islamic practices, as Western education is not the type of education permitted by Allah and His holy prophet." Nigerian authorities and the media were quick to blame the boys' kidnappings on bandits, as they have for many other atrocities in Nigeria's Middle Belt. For example, a recent Nigerian news report was headlined that 2 sisters were released after kidnapping by, quote, bandits. Deep into the article, the freed girls are quoted saying that their captors forcibly converted them to Islam. Clearly, more was involved than simple banditry, but no doubt the case was dutifully recorded as banditry in government databases. Of course, some cases are straight out banditry, but many bandits in this region seem motivated or mobilized by religious extremism. Many victims are selected according to their religious views with a jihadist intent of forcibly converting, humiliating, punishing, or eradicating them. An example is the murder on just December 10th in Niger State of 37-year-old Reverend Jeremiah Abraham of the Evangelical Church Winning All, and the abduction of his wife along with 4 other women who are being held for large ransoms now. Also, as the Council on Foreign Relations observes on its Nigeria blog, extremists often finance their campaigns through criminal activity. It's important to acknowledge that there may be more than one intent involved in these terrible attacks. The key is identifying ideological factors where they exist in Nigeria's relentless violence that would lead to more, because this would lead to more effective policy solutions. I recall the searing words of Bishop Kuka of Sokoto at the funeral mass of seminarian Michael Nadi, who was murdered in cold blood by kidnappers after he quoted scriptures to them during his captivity about a year ago. The bishop said, quote, "We are being told that this situation has nothing to do with religion. Really? Is that what happens when politicians use religion to extend the frontiers of their ambition and power? Are we to believe that simply because Boko Haram kills Muslims too, they wear no religious garb? Are we to deny the evidence before us of kidnappers separating Muslims from infidels or compelling Christians to convert or die?" The assignment of a single cause to such complex cases is a problem that mars the State Department's Religious Freedom Report on Nigeria. State's report of 2020 for 2019 narrowly defines the accelerating violence in Nigeria's Middle Belt, mainly in terms of mutual hostility between different classes of rural workers over economic competition due to climate change pressures, with religion being incidental. As the report states, it is, quote, a violent conflict over land and water resources, which frequently involve predominantly Muslim Fulani herders and settled farmers who are both Muslim and Christian. Climate change and economic resources, as well as religion, specifically Islamic extremism, are all significant in driving this violence. Additionally, some smaller scale defensive and retaliatory violence by Christians against Fulani Muslims has occurred. State's report omits all evidence of radicalization among some Fulani, specifically those involved in militant activity, mass atrocities, and supporting or working collaboratively with terror groups. State's report omits all reference to the term extremists in reference to the violent Fulani attackers. It ignores the important finding that, quote, Fulani extremists were the most active and deadly perpetrators of terrorism in Nigeria in 2018 by the Global Terrorism Database of the University of Maryland, established as a center of excellence by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security Science Technology Directorate. The Fulani in the neighboring Sahel have been recruited by ISIS and al-Qaeda, but State's report fails to examine whether they or Boko Haram are influencing or linked to segments of Nigerian Fulani. In October, proof of cross-border collaboration between networks of criminals and terrorists emerged in international media when U.S. Special Forces rescued American hostage Philip Walton from captivity in northern Nigeria. He had been abducted from his home in terror-plagued Niger by 6 unidentified men armed with AKs and riding motorcycles and trafficked into Nigeria. American officials feared he could be sold to Nigerian terror groups. Certainly, State has access to information of cross-border radicalization, terrorist recruitment, or support among Fulani nomadic herdsmen in this area. The All-Parliamentary Group, of which Baroness Cox is the co-chair, issued a report that finds, quote, while not necessarily sharing an identical vision, some Fulani herders have adopted a comparable strategy to Boko Haram and Islamic State of West Africa and demonstrated a clear intent to target Christians and symbols of Christian identity, such as churches. It also reported, quote, during many of the attacks, herders are reported by survivors to have shouted Allahu Akbar, destroy the infidel, and wipe out the infidels. It noted that some Fulani now carry out raids armed with AK-47s and rocket-propelled grenades. Only yesterday, a report of the UK-based CSW reported on Boko Haram's widening links to the Fulani and other militants across northern and central Nigeria. Quote, I'm quoting from their new report, in January 2020, Shekau, that's Boko Haram's leader, released a video in which he also spoke in the Fulani language. And in early July, an armed group in Niger state of Nigeria declared its allegiance to him. Later that month, the Nigerian press revealed that Shekau had cemented alliances with armed groups in Zamfara state in the northwest and was in the process of formalizing relations with groups in Katsina and Sokoto states, also in the northwest, and in Adamawa, Kogi, and Taraba states in central Nigeria. The state report omits reporting these ominous signs of possible genocide and ignores evidence that Christians and Muslims who reject extremist rules, along with international aid workers, are the primary civilian targets of the designated Nigerian terror groups. For years, Boko Haram's leader has been pledging in video rants to kill Christians and non-conforming Muslims because he believes God wants him to. To reemphasize, religion is not the only driver of the mass atrocities, but an analysis that reduces the violence in the center of the country to socioeconomic class confrontation due to climate change, as State's Nigeria report does, itself is a dangerous oversimplification, and one that does not lead to short-term solutions. Most certainly, not all 40 million members of the Fulani group in the region are Islamic extremists. However, there is evidence that some fraction of the Fulani have an explicit jihadi agenda, not only some in the Sahel who are known to have been recruited by the local affiliates of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, but also some in Nigeria's Middle Belt. It is wrong to suggest that there are so many complexities in Nigeria's situation that it would only deepen the conflict to document them, as the State Department report suggests. The state's annual reports are premised on the importance of shining light on religious freedom abuses, however complex, in order to end them. So a deepening Islamic extremism in Nigeria's northern and north-central states is now readily apparent. Secretary Pompeo has taken an important step this month in designating Nigeria as a CPC. USAID also has played an important role this year in supporting faith-based groups under fire in the hotspots. The following steps, however, are still urgently needed. First, the Secretary issued a waiver to CPC sanctions on Nigeria generally. Before he steps down, he should issue personalized global Magnitsky Act sanctions and target visa denials for Nigerian officials responsible for tolerating egregious religious attacks. There is, as we've heard the government's witnesses say, a lack of political will to start enforcing the law and prosecuting these people, or all attackers for that matter. And these sanctions might help them realize that we are serious and help them find a political will. Second, any remaining funds of the, quote, at least $50 million under the executive order that President Trump issued on June 2nd for advancing religious freedom should be approved by the Secretary of State for programming aimed at Nigeria to, quote, anticipate, prevent, and respond to attacks under its Section 3. And he should do this before the Secretary should do this before the administration leaves office. This should include a serious investigation into the role and nature of atrocities being committed by Fulani militants. The scale and gravity of the religious attacks requires immediate attention. Congress should adopt a resolution requiring the State Department to make a determination by a date certain on potential ethnic religious genocide and crimes against humanity by Boko Haram, Islamic State of West Africa, and Fulani militants. And then finally, Congress should debate and adopt a resolution affirming the responsibility of Boko Haram, Islamic State, and of West Africa and Fulani militants for ongoing genocide and crimes against humanity in the northern and north central areas of Nigeria. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Shea, for that very comprehensive and insightful, and your recommendations, your 5 recommendations. It's very, very helpful. I'd like to now ask Mr. Mike Jobbins if you could present your testimony.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Co-Chairman Smith and Co-Chairman McGovern, Congresswoman Jackson Lee, and Mr. Green, as well as Baroness Cox. We had the pleasure of feeding in quite significantly to the APVG report that you put together. It's really an excellent piece of work, and I would commend everyone in the audience to not only read the report itself, but also consider the well-reasoned and well-deliberated recommendations that you laid out in that document about how to move the situation forward. I'm the Vice President of Global Affairs with Search for Common Ground. My testimony is based on my organization's experience over the past 15 years of building peace, preventing violence, and transforming conflict in Nigeria. We have about 150 Nigerian colleagues from every corner of the country, from every religion and ethnic background, working day in and day out to build a more healthy, safe, and just Nigerian society and prevent violence in the Middle Belt, the Northeast, the Northwest, and the Delta. My testimony is informed by the time that I spent with Search for Common Ground. At the same time, the opinions that are expressed are my own, as are the recommendations. I'd also like to draw your attention to the testimony of my colleague and friend, Fatima Abubakar Madaki, in which she comments on the wider dynamics of international religious freedom as it relates to Nigeria and opportunities to strengthen interfaith collaboration as we address these issues. I'd ask also that my written testimony be submitted for the record. Building upon that, to focus my remarks here and in this format on what we would see as potential solutions to the crisis that many of the panelists and speakers have noted is unfolding, and the trauma, the deaths, the forced displacement that's unfolding across Nigeria's middle belt, as well as other parts of northern Nigeria and the Delta. We would note, as we look across this region, there are three main drivers of conflict that are unfolding. Of course, across thousands of attacks, you have thousands of motivations, thousands of killers, thousands of victims. And in any given case, the situation may differ and merits proper investigation and proper accountability. A priest was shot dead in his church. Was it a robbery? Was it because he was a priest? Was it because he was a community leader? Is it arresting the perpetrators and stopping the violence is the only way to ensure accountability and ensure that we're addressing the driver in any particular case? A Muslim teenage boy is beheaded while tending his herds. Is it revenge? Is it because he's a Muslim? Is it because of a cattle thief? It's impossible, again, to document why the motivations of every individual killer, because the justice system has been lamentably unable to bring these killers to account, something that I'll talk about in the recommendations. However, we can look at three major drivers and three major features of the violence. The first is the ordinary, is what others have sort of referred to as sort of the ordinary conflict. Cattle that grazes into farmers' fields, destroys the crops. A cow eats cassava. Cassava plants grow every 18 months. So if a cow eats your cassava, you and your family aren't able to eat for a year because that's how long it takes to grow. Cows that are dead or lost to rustling are worth $500 on the present market. If you lose a cow, that's the equivalent of losing a month's wage. And if you're not, and if you lose 100 cows, you're out $50,000. That's serious. That's serious money. That also attracts serious criminals. It attracts serious levels of weapons. It attracts serious organization. And we've seen across this region all three at play. We've seen organized, planned militia activity, intercommunal violence, and to some extent violent extremist activity. We've seen extremely sophisticated thievery, banditry, highwaymen, and rustling operations. And we've seen conflicts that begin between individual farmers and individual herders, bring in communities, bring in armed groups, and escalate beyond all control. The fact is that as the price of cattle has skyrocketed and as the price of Kalashnikovs has plummeted, the rural economy of Nigeria has become something akin to the American Wild West, where you have large numbers of highly valuable cows moving across rural areas, prey to bandits and heavily armed to protect, but often what is seen as protection, but often turning into aggression against communities. You have self-defense militias forming in the absence of a capable security force that are engaging in clashes, and you see, as a result, an overwhelmed security architecture that's unable to keep pace with the nature of the conflict driven by all three causes: the natural resource competition, the sophisticated criminality, and the violent extremist and intercommunal violence. Today, the Nigerian military is deployed in 28 out of Nigeria's 36 states. The internal security budget of the Nigerian army, setting aside the external, is 75 billion naira of the Nigerian currency. And the capability of the army thrust into the role of policemen in seeking to investigate and prevent attacks across an enormous swath of the country is sorely tested, particularly in the context of an institution that has known weaknesses in terms of institutional capacity, credible allegations of security, of human rights abuses, and corruption. That isn't to say that at the same time, and at the same time, although there's been progress on community policing, we haven't seen robust community engagement and effective security force behavior. This provides the kind of intelligence and the kind of early warning and early action that our State Department colleagues alluded to that can lead to preventing violence before it happens. However, we would also note that through our own work in peace building, through our support to early warning, and through our collaboration with Nigerian civil society, human rights organizations, and the National Human Rights Commission, we have seen some progress. And we've seen promising elements that could be taken to scale. There are examples within Nigeria for how you prevent this violence, how you prevent atrocities from happening, how you resolve the economic conflicts between farmers and herders, how you build a culture of religious tolerance. All of that is happening in parts of the Middle Belt, but needs support from both Nigerian authorities as well as the American people represented here in Congress to take those to scale. So, for example, in supporting peace architecture in Plateau State, we found that by bringing farmers and herder communities, Fulani and Berom, together, 75% afterwards better understood how conflicts and disputes were managed, how the other group saw the dynamics, and were able to agree a set of very practical steps to reduce conflict between the groups, banning children from manning cattle, banning night grazing, the kinds of things that easily trigger escalated violence between the groups. And we saw a 33% increase in collaboration between farmers and herders, between Christians and Muslims, between Fulani and Berom in those areas. We've seen the Plateau State Peacebuilding Agency, led by the Plateau government, deliver some promising results. We've also seen Adamawa State, for example, scale that up. We've supported early warning systems in collaboration with the State Department, the DRL, and the Nigerian government in areas affected by Boko Haram, as well as in Plateau State. That's disrupted dozens of attacks, prevented sexual violence, and also given communities a credible place to lodge complaints, and in some cases have ineffective and corrupt security forces removed and held accountable for their non-performance, and in some cases exploitation of the civilian population. And then finally, this is a multifaceted crisis, and we will be coming out in February, and I'll share with the commission and with the expert staff a toolkit mapping more than 300 research studies across Africa, across West Africa, on how you prevent atrocities, how you build peace, and how you bring the full of the mechanisms that the U.S. government and policymakers can bring to bear, from economic cooperation to agricultural strengthening to justice system support to security sector reform and the kinds of mill or security assistance that America provides, how you can structure those to bring about a more peaceful situation and a prevention and protection of these communities from the atrocious violence that's being experienced. Similar to my fellow panelists, I'd like to focus really on 5 practical things that Congress and the American government can do. The first, I'd like to take Congressman Green also up on his invitation for commentary, a wide-reaching resolution to focus not only Nigerian attention, but American government attention and American public attention on this issue would be most welcome, and would be very willing to work with him and his staff on the text and encourage its broad support. Additionally, we would love to welcome members of the Lantos Commission or their staffs during a congressional delegation to Nigeria to meet with victims throughout the country, to hear testimony, but also to witness and encourage the peace activists who are working day in and day out at great personal risk and often at public and private expense to chart a different kind of future for their country. And so we would love to welcome you when travel permits in Nigeria. Second, there's a fundamental funding issue. And as we enter a new Congress and we enter potentially an appropriation cycle, the fact is, despite the concerns that the American Congress and the State Department have expressed, less than 3% of U.S. support to Nigeria goes to supporting peace and security. There's a lot to humanitarian assistance. There's a lot to picking up the pieces, but there's very little to preventing the kinds of atrocities and enabling Nigerian people to take early action to support the kinds of early, either the accountability or the early warning systems that we spoke about. So we would ask that as the new Congress begins considering appropriations measures, to take seriously the recommendations by the Protection and Prevention Working Group, as well as the Alliance for Peace Building, the two main networks working on this issue, to ensure that there's full funding for the Human Rights and Democracy Fund, which is the parent account for religious freedom as well as justice and governance efforts, the Complex Crisis Fund and the Atrocities Prevention Fund, which enable rapid response to unfolding situations that we're seeing in Nigeria. And then finally, the People-to-People Reconciliation Fund, which has demonstrated through independent research has found that its programs have been highly effective in reducing the risk of violence across Nigeria's Middle Belt. And we would submit that that fund ought to be expanded and ought to be increasingly used in Nigeria. Third, there's a focus on every testimony from government as well as members of the commission and civil society have highlighted the role that impunity plays in driving conflict. And there's a lot that the U.S. Government can do on that score to improve both the documentation and evidence collection as well as the process of holding wrongdoers to account. The first is to renew support to the Nigerian Human Rights Commission with a particular focus on hearing cases linked not only to the direct abuses unfolding across Nigeria's Middle Belt, but also around the performance of state agents or non-performance, rather, in upholding their human rights duties and their duties of protection to their people. Second, I was very cheered to hear Ambassador Tam's comment and the involvement of GCJ in this hearing. I think the gov cooperation on strengthening prosecutions, police investigations would be very welcome. But third, that should be accompanied by assistance to civil society documentation. At the end of the day, across all of these testimonies, we've heard complaints or rejection of cases on the basis that documentation wasn't appropriately gathered or wasn't made available to the various bodies. There's a lot that can be done to support the Nigerian Bar Association, rights organizations, civil society groups in assembling and correctly documenting and packaging and presenting those cases to lay the evidentiary framework for an accountability process. Fourth, there's a need for the local media reporting. Several colleagues highlighted misreporting. There's also simply a lack of reporting. And although 70% of Nigerians consider this to be a major issue in their country, there's just simply a lack of explanation of serious investigation and reporting to the general public about how these events are unfolding, leading people to fall prey, in many cases, to stereotypes, misinformation, deliberate misinformation and rumors, whether that be put out by one of the armed groups or simply political interest groups or simply as a result of poor reporting. And then finally, my fellow panelist, Nina Shea, and throughout all of our remarks, there's been allusion to the lack of correct and adequate death counts and fact patterns. There's a lot that we can do on the civil society side, and perhaps with the involvement of the American government, to correct that and to ensure that we're appropriately and accurately tracking the human toll that is being exacted upon the people in Nigeria's Middle Belt and across Nigeria in general. For example, several speakers have highlighted the Global Terrorism Index data set, which uses University of Maryland research funded by the Department of Homeland Security. The fact is 90% of their files in their data set on violence in Nigeria attribute to Fulani extremists is incomplete. A number of the prominent cases that have emerged from that data set directly contradict news reporting by Nigerian and international press on the scene. There's deep inconsistencies between the different major data sets on how this violence is unfolding. ACLA data, the Global Terrorism and University of Maryland data, Nigeria Crisis Tracker from the Council on Foreign Relations, and a number of the data collected by organizations like ours. This is incredibly hard, but at the end of the day, we as a civil society community have to get together and be able to present Congress, to present the administration, present the Nigerian authorities with more comprehensive data about the nature and gravity of this crisis. The last two comments I would make are these. There is no silver bullet to ending the violence and ending the impunity in this region. However, the U.S. government has a wide set of mechanisms, from the justice and peace and security cooperation that we've spoken about at this hearing, but also all of the economic tools. USDFC, Development Finance Corporation, is lending to alleviate rural poverty. How is that contributing to an end to this violence? U.S. Department of Agriculture is promoting export and agricultural and livelihood and livestock trade with Nigeria. How does that fit in? And so there's a role for intergovernmental coordination, building on successful models, for example, that the Fish and Wildlife Service is piloting, called the African Pastoralism Working Group. There's the Atrocities Prevention Working Group studying mass atrocities, and there's a greater ability for the U.S. to move not only its peace and security, good governance, and religious freedom portfolio to improve this situation, but to develop a much more conflict-sensitive cooperation strategy and development assistance strategy that alleviates some of these root causes and that exacerbates through criminality, through just the sheer desperation of crushing poverty experience in this region, to alleviate those kinds of root cause factors that will forever cause instability and human suffering. And then finally, building on the CPC designation, there's a tremendous opportunity. I think Ambassador Brownback was right on the nose in leveraging the opportunity to encourage religions for peace in the country, rolling out and building on, for example, the Universal Code of Conduct of Holy Sites, the mutual recognition of senior Christian and Muslim leaders, of the principle of the sanctity of churches, mosques, graveyards, traditional sites among the traditional religionists. Second, in addition to the executive order funds that Ms. Shea alluded to, there's an opportunity to use the cultural heritage funds at the discretion of the American ambassador to strengthen the preservation of cultural heritage of importance to Christians and Muslims alike, as well as encourage shared respect and mutual understanding of each other's religions and of each other's sacred spaces. And then finally, to promote through educational and cultural exchange programs, the YALI program, but also expanding the Stevens Initiative, which is focused only on the Middle East and North Africa, but expanding those virtual exchange efforts into Nigeria to build a wider conversation around cultural diversity and exchange both within Nigeria and between Nigerian young people and American young people across all of their diversities. Because as Congresswoman Jackson Lee, as well as Chairman Smith alluded to, Nigeria is the largest economy in Africa, a critical partner of the United States. The Lancet, the medical journal, says that it'll be the second largest country in the world, passing China by the end of the century. And this, both for moral reasons as well as the sheer economic and political interests of the United States, is something that we must see progress on, and something where there's a long and bright future to build together on the other side of the tragic suffering that's being experienced at the moment.
Thank you very, very much. Mike, let me just make clear that we'll make your full statement a part of the record as you asked during the course of your testimony. Very, very wide-ranging and lots of good information, so thank you so very, very much. Our very last witness today is Udo Jude Ilo. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for this opportunity. I am really grateful that the committee deemed it expedient to deliberate on the challenge facing my country. Mr. Chairman, I'm an Igbo man from Southeast Nigeria, where I had my early education. I went to law school in Lagos, in the Southwest Nigeria, and I have spent the greater part of my professional life in Abuja, in North Central Nigeria. I am Catholic. It is really very convenient for me to reduce the challenges in the middle belt of Nigeria to a simple tagline of religious violence or ethnic war. But Mr. Chairman, it is not. It is something much more insidious. It is about a country that has lost its soul. a country disfigured by years of crass misrule, with a focus on power, money, and horrid disdain for the welfare of the people. A country numbed by relentless violence that is inflamed by uncontained criminality, religious extremism, and abject poverty. And a country that is being destroyed by distrust, suspicion, and fractured social, ethnic, and religious relationships. Mr. Chairman, the Middle Belt of Nigeria is a victim of bad governance, weak institutions, and poverty. And the situation is much more complex than violence against a religious group or violence between religious groups. An estimated 60,000 people have been killed because of the farmer herder-related violence in Nigeria since 2001. In 2016, more deaths were attributed to this violence than to Boko Haram menace in the region. The violent clashes between herders and farmers are not unique to Nigeria in West Africa. However, in Nigeria, this issue intersects and is conflated by pre-existing tensions in already very fragile states. Many of the herders in Nigeria are Fulani and are Muslim, nomadic pastoralists, and so conflicts are easily and often miscategorized as religious contestations. Added to this, Mr. Chairman, is the indigenous settler-related conflicts prevalent in many states and intrinsically tied to access to scarce resources and political opportunities. But this is not the full story. There is a growing banditry in the region which has crippled insecurity, loss of livelihood, and a heightened distrust amongst communities. The Middle Belt is susceptible to this level of violence and instability for a number of reasons, Mr. Chair. There is, of course, what have been mentioned here, the dwindling pasture and fodder resources because of climate change, which has increased contestation for scarce resources. There has been influx of foreign pastoralists due to the porous border, and of course their subsequent encroachment into cropland, and the conflict that arises from it, and the fact that these people have not documented the inability of the state to hold them accountable when they wreak havoc in the region. There is dwindling water resources, again because of the desertification in the country, and the inability of government to put in policies that can address this kind of problem. There is the poor handling of land cases by traditional rulers and our courts, leading many to resort to self-help and violence to protect their proprietary interests. There's, of course, the absence of effective government policies for inclusive economic and political opportunities. Youth illiteracy and unemployment is quite acute in the Middle Belt of Nigeria. There's proliferation of arms in millions, Mr. Chairman, across the country. And of course, as has been mentioned by some of the people who have testified here today, the lack of capacity by the Nigerian police to prevent violence, stop violence, or ensure accountability for violence. There's a huge loss of trust between communities, amongst communities, and between communities and security agencies due to historic grievances and unresolved cases of abuse against these communities. And of course, the lack of initiative and political will by successive governments in Nigeria to take drastic action to address underlying drivers of conflict. Mr. Chairman, religion and ethnicity are also factors. Over the years, politicians across the aisle have consistently used religion and ethnicity as a tool of mobilization for political power. Oftentimes, these narratives paint the other as the enemy and the reason for underdevelopment in communities. This toxic manipulation has destroyed long-standing relationships across communities and hampered the capacity of communities to engage in peaceful dialogue and resolve issues amicably. The structure of government has also amplified this tension. The character of our politics, which places ethnic and religious affinity over competence, in many cases, have seen communities reasonably believe that government is against them. Currently, Mr. Chair, about 90% of Nigeria's security architecture is firmly under the control of individuals who either speak the same language as the president or adhere to the same faith. The current Nigerian president, by the way, is a Muslim. This kind of exclusive behavior creates the perception of an in-group of those who are in power and an out-group of those not belonging to the same linguistic or religious groups. It also sustains the perception of state-sponsored or condoned harm against ethnicities, ethnic groups and religious groups that are not in power, like the situation we currently have in the Middle Belt. Addressing this challenge, Mr. Chairman, will require very fundamental action. But I think I must restate the point that we must resist the temptation to frame these conflicts in the simplistic terms of religious and ethnic strife. While they both play a role, understanding the other fundamental drivers around access to food and land, criminality, and of course the fractured social structures will be critical in designing a comprehensive solution. The blame must be placed where it's supposed to be, at the feet of our government, who over the years have consistently failed to take bold action to stem criminality, to punish people who kill other people, or to upset whatever political or ethnic allegiance they have in order to work for the common good of the country. Their inability to secure this country has emboldened criminals who try to parade either under ethnic or religious cover to wreak harm and terror in the country. And people who are in positions of authority must be held accountable individually for what they have done. And on this score, the United States and international community should support the effort of Nigerians to ensure that these individuals are made to feel personal discomfort for their inability to do their duty to their country. Engagement also must focus on enhancing a holistic policy response. And not just having this policy response, but making sure that we pressure our government to see through those policy responses. And in doing this, amplify victims' voices to ensure adequate support, accountability, and stability. We can't make the point enough that the absence of accountability, the absence of punishment, the absence of prosecution of individuals who are implicated in this violence has been the greatest problem with stemming this violence. And every way Nigeria can be helped to ensure that accountability must be pursued so that people will know there are consequences for these actions. And again, the donor community should continue to channel support to community-based projects around peace building. There are very instructive attempts being made at community level to address some of these challenges. There are lessons that can be learned, that can be escalated, amplified, and utilized in other communities. But this effort will require the support of international community and, of course, the government of Nigeria. Mr. Chairman, I must also add that there is need to amplify the voices of moderates across the divide in this conflict. Increasingly, people are forced to take extremist view on how to confront what is happening in the Middle Belt. And we must make an attempt to amplify moderate voices, support the effort at peace building, because this issue, this violence, these killings cannot be solved with more violence. It has to be solved by dialogue between communities who have to accept amongst themselves that enough is enough. But that effort will require the support of both the government of Nigeria and Nigerian friends in the international communities. And finally, Mr. Chairman, what is happening in the middle belt of Nigeria is a shame for Nigeria. What is happening in the middle belt should not be happening. This is a region of Nigeria that is lush, that is fertile, that is the food basket of Nigeria. It has not always been a very violent place, but because of the level of mismanagement and incompetence in leadership, we are where we are today. And Nigeria requires, citizens require the support of the international community to ensure that the effort of civil society groups, the effort of moderates within the country, the effort of religious groups to build a different narrative and a different history for this region is not in vain. And the government that has more or less become a stumbling block to this process needs to also understand that the international community is watching. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you so very much for your excellent contribution. I just have a few questions. I mean, your testimonies and the great thought and analysis that went into preparing those, what a great benefit that is to this commission and to the Congress. So I want to thank you for that. This information will be spread far and wide. It informs members. It informs, I believe it helps the administration, no matter who the administration is, to get a real comprehensive feedback as to what needs to be done. So thank you so very much for all of that. I do have just a few final questions, and then I'll yield to Ms. Jackson Lee because I know she has some additional questions as well. You know, there seems to be, in my sense, or at least I have it, you know, like a renewed hope that we might be able to really help the Nigerians help themselves even more because, after all, they are the prime, the responsibility is theirs primarily. And there are good people, great people there who want to do the right thing. Resources, training, and the like are sometimes a very real problem. But, you know, we don't want to have a false sense of hope either. You know, the designation of CPC hopefully is a true wake-up call to the Buhari government, and many of you have commented on that. And it's only a matter of whenever the administration would like to say, that's it, we're going to impose sanctions, that, you know, maybe they'll see that we're not kidding. There were about 18 specific sanctions prescribed in both economic and security related, starting with the simple démarche, but it goes far beyond that, in the International Religious Freedom Act. So the tools that are in that toolbox are very significant, and they must be used. You know, if you just say we're threatening and they say, okay, you don't mean it, well, then we have squandered an opportunity. Additionally, the Magnitsky Act, Global Magnitsky, empowers the administration with the ability to truly level serious sanctions economically as well as visa ban on those who are individually culpable of committing serious human rights abuse. So our hope is to this and any subsequent administration that will be used. There's no reason to wait. It needs to be used and utilized. Perhaps one or more of you might want to speak to the ICC. When we had some minimal hope, and it was minimum for me, in 2013 that they might take action, I had no sense that it was going to be real. But now there seems to be a coalescing of a lot of all of you providing documents like the Jubilee campaign, doing that excellent report on these crimes. So my hope is that they will take very seriously all of that input, and some of you might want to speak to that, and also to speak to how long. You know, delay is denial for that next victim, he or she, or some young child who may find themselves slaughtered by the Fulani radical Islamists. There needs to be that sense that there's a heightened sense of urgency here. And I do hope that Buhari takes the cue that the United States, at least, and hopefully the ICC, the international community, Baroness Cox, and our good friends across the ocean, that everybody is uniting. I mean, everyone's starting to realize this is another genocide that must be combated, and it must be done so immediately. So there's just some of the questions. You know, Mike Jobbins, your point about the the deployment of the military throughout several of the states. The question always is, how many? Are they sufficiently trained? And then there's also the big question, we haven't really spoken about this today, but with regards to China, what role, if any, positive or negatively, is China playing in Nigeria today? We know that throughout all of Africa, throughout all of the world, their bad governance model under Xi Jinping is being very aggressively promoted. We know that AK-47s and a lot of material that can be used to kill people has been conveyed through the PRC. They do it in their own country. They do it internationally as well. So if any of you want to focus for a moment or two on what role China might be playing in all of this, I would appreciate it. But again, your testimonies are very comprehensive. They give us a great set of actions that Congress and the executive branch and the international community as well ought to take. So if anyone would like to speak to any of those, please do. Sure, and there is a vote on, and my good friend and colleague Sheila Jackson-Lee would like to ask a question or two as well. And without objection, Jane Adolph, a professor who was supposed to be here, regrettably she had a family emergency that arose, so without objection, her testimony will be made a part of the record. But Sheila? Ms. Jackson-Lee, are you there?
Yes.
Okay. If you have
Mr. Chairman, Mr.
Yes,
Commissioner.
Yes, if you could. We're doing a concluding questions, if you would.
Thank you so very much.
You bet.
And thank you to all the witnesses that have presented such an important statement. I want to go to the Bishop, Bishop Avanya, and thank you so very much for representing the religious community. It's extremely important. I spoke of the government's seeming lack of involvement. What would be, from the religious community's perspective, the most important work that the government could do as the upholder of the laws and the upholder of the national government? What is the most important action that the government could have?
Unfortunately, Commissioner, the bishop had to leave, but maybe one of the other panelists might want to speak to that because it's a great question.
Thank you.
If I may? Could I have your permission?
Absolutely, please do.
Yeah, go right ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for that question, Congresswoman Sheila. A number of points. I think one of them that's come out here today is the inability of government to secure the space.
What did the bishop say?
So a bit of proactive policing, being able to prevent these things from happening in the first place, will be really useful. And that will require some considerable amount of work in building the trust of the communities, so that they can at least provide intelligence to the security agencies. But the second aspect of what I want to mention is the posture and the body language of government. So you will hear stories of these killings happening, and there will be no statement from government. They won't visit the community. Nothing symbolic is done to show empathy and sensitivity to what is going on. In some instances, government will be quick to label everybody as miscreants or violence or people who are trying to hype what is going on. So that's the stubborn lack of empathy, the stubborn lack of sensitivity, the stubborn lack of compassion on the part of government reinforces the message that perhaps government has taken side in what is happening. And government being able to behave a bit differently when these things happen is enough to reassure the communities of government's commitment to treat every side to the conflict, fairly and equally. And what goes into that again is that beyond just the symbolic aspect of the government work, the idea of victim protection, victim support, rebuilding is really crucial. Because you hear stories of people who have been displaced from their communities, not being able to go back in years. So government is not even making adequate effort to make sure that these people can go back home. So when government doesn't show empathy, when it doesn't punish offenders, when it doesn't support communities that have been traumatized by this violence, it is a total disregard and a total abandonment of its own duties. And when it doesn't do this, people then have reasonable grounds to believe that either government is complicit in this violence, or to some extent they have endorsed the violence.
Thank you. Yes, and I'm going to keep with this question, and then I'm going to yield back, Mr. Commissioner. I have to go vote. Yes, Madam, please answer. I'm not seeing you. I'm sorry, I'm virtual and I can't see who it is. Is that Nina? Okay. Can you unmute?
Yes, got it.
Please, thanks.
Thank you, Congresswoman. One of the CSIS think tank did a report for USAID earlier this fall about the Boko Haram areas in the north and about how there was very little information coming out. We know the overall picture, of course. We know that there's over 1 million women who are displaced and in a very precarious and dangerous situation when that happens, when they go out for firewood, when they leave the camp. There's no security for them and they get attacked. But it's a terrible situation. But the journalists can't report on this or criticize the government because of their speech laws. And the government has taken out a lot of punishment for those journalists. They're in prison, they're on trial for being critical of the government of Nigeria by reporting on these situations. And this was the CSIS finding. So this is not my finding, but the think tank finding. So that is something very concrete to talk to President Buhari about freeing the journalists, letting them report on what's going on in this area.
That is very helpful. It seems adverse to those of us who believe in human rights and free speech in terms of a country that wouldn't allow freedom of speech to say what is wrong. And that looks like something that would be a governmental action that should be done to report what is wrong, what is harmful.
That's a good idea.
Anyone else want to comment on the government's work?
Can I make a brief contribution? Caroline Cox speaking.
Thank you.
Just very briefly, I would like to emphasize, pick up a point that's just been made, the huge urgent need for rehabilitation. When we work with the people who've suffered so much, I showed the picture of the lady whose finger was cut off and stuck in her daughter's mouth. But wherever we go, there are people who suffer the after effects, physical and psychological, of the trauma and the atrocities that have been perpetrated upon them. And that really does need an urgent approach of physical and psychological rehabilitation, as well as the practical need for humanitarian aid, where people have lost everything. They've lost their homes, their livelihoods, they're left destitute. And so I would just flag up the importance of putting into the recommendations the need for rehabilitation, psychological and physical. And there's another lady I met just very, very briefly, and the jihadist amputated her left arm at the elbow, so she didn't have an arm left or anything. And then she put her hands up to protect her face when they were wielding machete, and all her fingers fell down in front of her. So she had nothing, she couldn't have to do anything for herself. And I could modify that so many times. So I put up rehabilitation, physical and psychological, and also the need for humanitarian aid. I'm sorry, the British government is not doing anything in Middle Belt. I don't know why, but we need to do a sort of large-scale survey of where the aid priorities are. And there are millions displaced in that part of Nigeria. So I would just like to flag up those two criteria of rehabilitation and humanitarian aid for people who've lost everything. Thank you very much.
Well, let me conclude if there are no other witnesses to comment. And that is to thank the witnesses. We can only do a deep dive on these issues if we have experts like yourself. I've been working with Nigeria since having gone to school there some many years ago, certainly as a younger version of myself. But in any event, it has a great promise. And it has a great ability to be a leader among nations. And we cannot continue to use humanitarian groups and various religious charities and obviously the lack of desire by the United States to use military force, even though members of the Congressional Black Caucus fought to have a peaceful presence with respect to a military presence, which is AFRICOM. But I believe it has to be the very point of a government being interested, concerned about victims, looking at the landscape of their laws, changing small laws about allowing reporting of heinous incidences, but letting the people know that they are cared for, giving them the courage to report. And I've said over and over again, investing in the North, in these young boys that are being recruited by Boko Haram. I'm understanding now that the 300 boys have been released. But how many families can tolerate their children trying to be in school with this no Christian education rule, that their children are in jeopardy, or families are in jeopardy, or women are being burned, or homes are being burned, or men are being burned and decapitated? So I look forward to a deep collaboration on this issue. And I look forward to working with all of you and the Tom Lantos Commission. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Sheila. And would any of you like to answer some of the questions that I had posed? And as you're doing it, there is a story.
Mr. Commissioner?
Yeah, go ahead.
Mr. Commissioner?
Yes.
I'm sorry, as I close, I do want to go on record for supporting Mr. Green's legislation. Thank him for participating. And I'm sorry, I'm happy to yield back now. Okay. Sorry. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you. There is a Wall Street Journal article, just because I know you'll all be interested if you haven't seen it, that it starts off by saying more than 300 schoolboys kidnapped in northern Nigeria have been handed over to government security agencies, according to the Katsina state governor. So hopefully that's an accurate report, but it is in the Wall Street Journal just 8 minutes ago. But if you wouldn't mind answering or addressing some of those questions, if you'd like.
Thank you, Co-Chair Smith, if I may. I may pass on on a panel of lawyers. I won't deign to weigh into, or I won't dare to weigh in too much on the legal dynamics of international law, but I would highlight the importance of grassroots level documentation, both to present cases to the Nigerian institutions and then to lay the groundwork for any wider legal actions. The actual people, the people who are going out, constituting the cases, collecting evidence, taking photographs at the scale to lay the evidence base for prosecution, and that's the foundation for a lot of this accountability. And then, of course, it's on all of us to support the Nigerian civil society and the Nigerian government to seek accountability through truth and reconciliation processes, through criminal justice, through the Human Rights Commission, the different measures allowed under law of Nigeria, as well as the laws of the international mechanisms to which it's subscribed. The question that you've directed at me was on the Nigerian police, on the Nigerian military.
Right. What
I might say is there's a challenge on the fundamental role of the security architecture writ large. No amount of training will turn a warfighter into a policeman. And one of the challenges is not the Nigerian military's capacity, although there are challenges in capacity and training and oversight, but it's fundamentally about which services are being asked to do which jobs. And so a lot of the challenges that were highlighted, and I think I would encourage America in its assistance to focus on, would be the role of INL at the State Department, the role of other security assistance programs, and strengthening the police and supporting the potential community policing initiatives, and importantly, in building the community side of the community security relationships. Because as the bishop, the representative cited, if no one calls 911 and no one comes, then they're going to stop calling 911 because that relationship of trust has been broken. And so where we've seen explicit relationships built between security officials who are participating in dialogues with communities, listening to where their predecessors had failed, listening to what communities want and taking reports and feeding back in that loop, we've seen a much better security outcomes. And then the final thing that I would highlight is there's often a focus on the national police, potentially the community police, the Nigerian military, but I wouldn't ignore the specialized security agencies that can play extremely positive roles. For example, we haven't spoken much today about the role of opioids and tramol, the drug, in some of this violence, but the Nigerian Drug Law Enforcement Agency has a critical role to play in security within that special niche area. There's a new force called the Agro-Pastoral Rangers, something akin to the Texas Rangers in America or the Canadian Mounties in Canada, of much more mobile policing specialized in addressing some of these issues. That could be quite promising. The role of the highway and traffic control, which is one of the most heavily deployed forces, but extremely under-resourced and under-mandated in rural Nigeria. So there's a lot of other kinds of security services that could also have a positive impact when they're working in close partnership with the communities. And as we're working towards a situation where there are just fewer active military deployments for internal security affairs within Nigeria. And then finally, to the question of China and the intersection of Chinese governance and business practices in influencing the security and human rights context in Nigeria, one element that I would highlight is the leadership role that both America and frankly also Britain, since we have a member of parliament on this panel, have played in upholding business and human rights standards in Nigeria and in the world through multi-stakeholder initiatives like ICOCA, governing private security, through the voluntary principles where Nigeria is a focus country, governing the extractive industries. And to the extent that there is a partnership in this, in the new administration, when it comes in the new Congress, in strengthening the role of American enterprise in promoting business and human rights in Nigeria, makes America a much more attractive business partner, but also aligns the economic arguments behind improved security sector governance, reduced corruption, and along the lines of a lot of the aims and interests that we're discussing today. So I would highlight that as something that the Lantos Commission might also consider taking up for particular study as it relates to Nigeria and other societies that are experiencing serious conflict around the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If I could, I'll ask a couple of more questions in the sense, and if any of you have to leave, you've been very gracious with your time during the course of this hearing. One of the things, when we're talking about response time and whether or not the police show up when an atrocity is about to occur or is occurring, or petty crime, response time is important, but who shows up is also important. And Baroness Cox knows so well, as do so many others in the UK, how important it was to make sure that the Northern Irish Police Force, the RUC as it used to be called, which used to have a lot of complaints against it for its bias. It is now integrated with both Catholics and Protestants and is doing a tremendous job in everyday policing because that sectarian divide has at least been overcome to a great extent. One of the things that when Goodluck Jonathan was the president, his command was integrated with both Christians and Muslims. I met with a lot of the top commanders on trips to Abuja, for example, and there was an attempt at least to try to have both religious parties, so to speak, represented. Under Buhari, that seems to not to be the case. And if you get Fulani-dominated police, the outcomes might be a disaster, or at least there will be a lack of respect on the part of other communities because they're not sure how well or poorly they may be treated. Second question would be, the ICC has now said they're looking at human rights in Nigeria, and that's good. They've done that before and said the Fulani, as the Jubilee campaign pointed out, were not there wasn't enough evidence. I think there's more than enough evidence now. But I worked very hard but failed to get a special court for Syria, for the atrocities that were committed by ISIS. We had David Crane sit right in this hearing room testifying to the need for a hybrid court like the Court of Sierra Leone that he so professionally led. And ultimately, Charles Taylor got 50 years for his horrific crimes that he committed as president of Liberia, and many others went to prison. Would any of you think that we have a genocide occurring, at least that what it appears to be to me and to many others? I think it's almost self-evident, but the crimes are horrific. There's certainly crimes against humanity being committed. What would your thoughts be, and if you don't want to respond or you want to do it in writing later, to a hybrid court like the former Yugoslavian court, the Court of Sierra Leone, and the Rwandan court, where the prosecutions are, one of the criticisms of the ICC in the past by both the Kenyans and others is that it's usually focused predominantly on Africa and on Africa players who are doing terrible things. Would a hybrid court be a better solution, more responsive to the needs? And again, as was mentioned, I think, Mike, you might have mentioned this, the importance of retaining evidence that can evaporate like the dew, the night's dew, if it's not retained, so that you can effectuate prosecutions against perpetrators of crimes, it needs to be in this mix as well. So if anybody, and nobody wanted to speak to China, I guess, if you want to do it for the record, that would be great too, what role they may be playing.
Could I answer the question on the International Criminal Court? This is Ann Bowalda.
Oh, yes, Ann, go ahead.
So I have met on 3 occasions with the Office of the Prosecutor with the International Criminal Court. And one of the concerns that they keep raising that they need, and all of our organizations could assist with, is to provide them with specific individuals or groups beyond the Boko Haram and ISWAP that we've already discussed. But there are other Fulani militant groups and individuals basically need to know the masterminds. They need credible evidence and information as to who particularly that they should be looking at to prosecute. And if you're looking at a hybrid court, it's the same type of scenario. Obviously, Boko Haram continues to need to be prosecuted, and the individuals within it that head the organization, that are in charge of operations, those people need to be, prosecutions need to take place. The organization itself needs to be dismantled. I like the idea of having a special Rangers force. It was very effective in Indonesia back 10 or 15 years ago. When Laskar Jihad was active in Indonesia, the Indonesian government was able to dismantle it with a specific targeted ranger group that went after them. So I would certainly encourage that the Nigerian government, they have to know who's behind it. They have to know which organizations, who's at the head of those organizations. Those names need to be provided to the International Criminal Court. We as organizations need to also disclose that information. Jubilee Campaign did a survey of our partners and a number of others, and 2 years ago we did submit a separate report to the International Criminal Court where we featured a number of individuals and organizations that we thought that they should look at. I think all of the organizations acting together, taking clarity of who's behind it and what kind of interests are actually funding it, and then going after those sources and resources. So I would definitely support the International Criminal Court taking action. One of the things we've called for, and I know that David Alton, member of the House of Lords in the UK, has been working with as well, is trying to promote within the United Nations having a commission of inquiry. if there were significant numbers of victims surveyed, they may also be able to disclose who it is that had perpetrated the violence against them. And I think that would, again, that gathering of information would be extremely useful to all of those efforts to bring about accountability.
Would anyone else like to respond? If not,
could I just add Could I add something very briefly?
Oh, sure, absolutely, Baroness Cox.
Thank you. It's very brief. And my good friend Lord Alton is very active on getting a clear definition and recognition of what is genocide. He moved an amendment which was successful in the House of Lords last Monday, getting a particular situation defined as genocide. And I think there have been so many unrecognized genocides. And of course, with genocide comes the responsibility to take appropriate action, provide, protect, to call to account, to do away with impunity. And I think that would be a very important aspect of what might be one of the possible outcomes to inquiries into what's been happening in Nigeria, because it does bring back into focus the concept of genocide. As there's been a lot of unrecognized genocides. At the moment, we're very busy trying to get what's happened in Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh, and particularly what's been done by Azerbaijan, have been very active in that area as genocide. But unless we recognize genocide for what it is, and that's one place where Genocide Watch has decreed that Azerbaijan fulfills all the criteria of genocide, and then I think countries will continue to get away with impunity. So I'd just like to flag up the possibility of taking seriously the recognition of those aspects of what's happened in Nigeria as genocide, taken seriously and considered for their implications. Thank you.
If I could, Baroness Cox, what's your thought about trying to get the treaty body that implements the Genocide Convention at the United Nations to seriously undertake, in addition to the ICC, it would be separate from that, but it would be to pursue that. What is your thoughts on that?
Well, thank you very much. I would be very strongly in favour. The report that we brought out in the All-Party Parliamentary Group in the UK is called Unfolding Genocide ? But behind that, of course, is the belief that there is potentially a genocide there to be recognised, and if it's recognised, then to be responded to appropriately. So I think the arenas where it could be taken up, addressed, and to which appropriate response could be taken would be very, very important. And also to help to prevent further genocides. Impunity and genocide not acknowledged is an encouragement for more perpetrations of the kinds of things which should constitute a genocide.
Thank you so very much. And please convey my best and other members of the Commission who think the world of David Alton as well. Anybody else?
I certainly will.
Thank you. Anybody else like to respond or not?
Congressman,
Nina.
Mr. Chairman. Yes, I just wanted to raise the problem again that we've had continuously about the documentation gap. And there is not a strong sense in many sectors of the world, particularly secular organizations, that there is a religious problem at all in Nigeria. And so I think that an initial step really must be to strengthen the gathering of documentation to convince a political movement behind a genocide investigation. The government of Nigeria has no political will to go in that direction, of course. There are networks in northern Nigeria and central Nigeria that can be relied on. There are tribal networks, there are ethnic networks, there are religious networks, other civil society outposts there, and they should be trained how to document human rights violations and in a useful way so that we do find out more about the identity of the perpetrators and the response or lack of response of the government. I mean, the CPC designation was because the government's failing to respond, and we've seen this over and over again including with the beheadings. I mean, there's so many catastrophes and atrocities there that we haven't even talked today much about the beheadings of 100 people, farmers in Borno over Thanksgiving weekend. It's overshadowed by the latest atrocity. So, and I'm very happy to hear that the boys are being returned to their families. So I think that the U.S. government, the British government, should be getting behind an effort to start activating the networks that are already in these locales, giving them whatever internet or high-tech equipment they need, cell phones, whatever they need to really document this and start in a serious way and with a real template, asking consistent questions about probing it, who's behind it, what the context was, what the larger, and you know, this was done in Latin America in the 80s by the Catholic bishops there, and Latin America was mostly Catholic, and it was a very effective way of gathering information. It raised people's consciousness around the world, and it changed American policy. And I think that that is what we should be thinking of. I strongly believe that that is the way to go as an initial step, or maybe simultaneous step with going to the court. Because right now there is a lot of denial, including from President Buhari. If you see his response to the CPC designation, his immediate response is that this is a misunderstanding, that they value and treasure religious freedom, and there is no problem. And that is echoed. It's actually echoed in the State Department Religious Freedom Report, as I tried to point out. It's a widely held view, as I found in American governmental circles. So I'm very concerned with the incoming administration may continue this, and as climate change becomes a more dominant issue, with Secretary Kerry moving into that slot, that is going to overshadow these problems, and there's going to be very little interest. So I think that if this administration, in its waning days, could do something for, using these funds that it has, and Mike, I think, identified several funds. I identified several in my testimony. There's the Religious and Ethnic Minorities Fund. There's the Atrocity Prevention. There's the EO, Advancing Religious Freedom Fund. Some of that money should be going to help these people tell their story, what's happening to them, in a useful way. Thank you.
Ms. Shea, thank you so very much. It's a great idea. We will follow up on it. Anyone else?
Sorry, may I be very rude and interrupt for one moment? Because I'm afraid I have to leave you. It's extremely late over here.
I know.
And it's a privilege to be part of this very, very informative dialogue. I'm sorry to leave some of my best friends I recognize from the other side of the Atlantic, but I'm afraid I do have to leave you. But I look forward to keeping in touch. And thank you very much for letting me participate in what's been a truly challenging and inspirational occasion.
Well,
thank you so
Scott,
much, Chairman.
It's been an honor to have you here, and for all of us to benefit from your expertise and your tremendous commitment. Thank you.
Well, it's been an honor to be with you and benefit from all your expertise. Thank you so much, and I hope you keep in touch.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
So we will follow up, and I thank you, Anina, for that final comment too on accountability and using money to create the narrative based on facts of people telling their stories, and then using that in an actionable way to make the case that a genocide is unfolding right before our eyes. Thank you all for being online, for your tremendous, I mean, you have given us a blueprint. We have to follow up. The key is always in the follow-up, but we have very, very well-informed people who have provided us expert witness, and the testimony, I should say. So I want to thank you so very, very much. The hearing is adjourned.